Hey everybody, this is heading 3 of section 1 of chapter 3 of part 1 of Ingo Elbe's Marx in the West, the new reading of Marx in the Federal Republic since 1965. Chapter 3 is titled Object Theoretical Consequences. Section 1 of chapter 3 is titled Critique of Pre-Monetary Value Theory, Abstract Labor, Value, and Money. And heading 3 is titled Engaging with or Sidestepping Ambivalences, Intraparadigmatic Variance in the Debate Concerning Marx's Non/Substantialist Value Theory. Alright, let's fucking rock. Since the mid-1970s, the problem of the form theory of labor, conceived as a non-substantialist theory of value, has also engaged a number of theorists whose contributions delineate the boundaries between naturalistic and social theoretical determinations of value substance in a manner distinct from that of Brentel and Heinrich. Parenthesis, U. Müller, K. Holtz, D. Wolff, Eiber, Pistone, Kurtz, Kremer, as well as Nanninga, Krause, Schempel, Steinfort, and Buhler. If as recently as 2004 it could still be observed that the quote, interpretation of the category of abstract labor will likely remain one of the most discussed and contested problems in international Marx scholarship for the foreseeable future, then the following section may perhaps serve to provide an impression of the heterogeneity and diversity of interpretive approaches that are or have been evident within Germany alone. As early as the 1970s, Ulrich Müller attempted to make sense of the ambivalences within Marx's determination of value substance. Regarding Marx's assertion that the expenditure of labor power in a physiological sense constitutes the value of a commodity, Müller offers the following, quote, proposal for terminological precision, end quote. Quote, strictly speaking, it ought to be stated more explicitly, abstract labor forms value wherever this process of abstraction actually takes place socially. That is, where production is for exchange. It thus becomes the creator of commodity value, end quote. Müller argues that Marx fails to indicate clearly enough that, in this instance, he is, quote, once again departing from the general consideration of value substance, end quote. Müller thus effectively bifurcates the concept of value in order to integrate this passage from Marx into a consistent interpretive framework. On the one hand, value is produced by labor simpliciter, a notion intended to legitimize the physiological approach, such that, quote, the value of the thing, is constituted by the fact that labor has been expended in the production of the useful good, end quote, which is why the products of labor are, quote, never valueless, end quote. On the other hand, however, it is only exchange-oriented labor that brings forth commodity value as a historically specific form, a process that in turn endows the aforementioned, quote, possession of value, end quote, with, quote, social relevance, end quote. What Marx has already detailed at length above refers to as the, quote, content of the determination of value, end quote, namely the social interdependence inherent in the division of labor, and the universal necessity of allocating labor time across all social formations, is in Müller's analysis elevated to the status of the very concept of value itself. What initially appears to be a purely nominal operation, one that is superfluous and merely serves to exacerbate the very terminological imprecisions Müller seeks to critique, is transformed by his thesis that, in introducing the concept of value substance in section 1.1, Marx is dot dot dot. One second. Some fuck up here. Fuck. Yeah, let me run this through the translator actually real quick. Fuck. Yeah, no, this is kind of a weird thing. So I'll just read it what I have here. Actually, it's fucking, if it sucks, it sucks. It transforms by his thesis that in introducing the concept of value substance, section 1.1, Marx is dot 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 of capital. Fuck, I don't know. Generally not in the sense of commodity value, but rather of value, and in the ahistorical sense of an implicit determinant of all economic activity, to a value theoretical substantialism. Mueller not only terminologically doubles the concept of value, such that commodities appear as, quote, use value, value, commodity value, and, quote, units, but he also assigns the category of value substance, or simply value, a category which, at the level of abstraction of the first section, where exchange relations are provisionally bracketed, even though they are implicitly presupposed at all as real, is to be grasped merely analytically to an ahistorical rational abstraction. Just as the concept of, quote, labor, according to Marx, can only be fully developed under capitalist conditions, yet may nonetheless lay claim to validity regarding the metabolic interaction between humans and nature across all modes of production, so too, Mueller argues, does the concept of value emerge only through the predominance of exchange-induced real abstractions from use value. Yet it too serves as a valid description of the temporal dimension inherent in every economy. Value and value substance, as presented at the beginning of Marx's Capital, are, precisely because they constitute conceptual abstractions, merely nominal abstractions, regarding properties common to all human production, quote, socially non-specific concepts applicable in a variety of analytical contexts, end quote. Consequently, value, much like labor, is deemed unsuitable as a starting point for the exposition of capitalist forms of wealth, since no path leads from this transhistorical category to the specific determinations of modern wealth. The introduction of the category of value substance is thus held to designate a level of abstraction that, quote, in terms of its content, transcends the specific society in question, quote. Quote, the exposition of value substance and its measure of magnitude operates on a level of abstraction that renders, quote, value independent of any specific society, end quote. Thus, the argument circles back to W.F. Haug's thesis that the analysis of value substance, much like that of use value, attains a, quote, natural basis level, end quote. Mueller fails to entertain the idea that the characterization of value abstraction as a, quote, thought thing, or as a category initially brought into existence solely through, quote, our analysis, should be interpreted as an indication that this serves as a description of the real abstraction, quote, commodity value, unquote, generated within the exchange process, an abstraction that can be grasped by the theorist only conceptually, for as long as the exchange process has not yet caused the value character of the commodity to manifest, quote, through its own relation to the other commodity, quote, through its relation to the other commodity, end quote. Moreover, this analytical reduction via thought is necessary because the real abstraction occurring within exchange never causes value to appear as such, but always in the objective form of exchange value. Thus, in Mueller's account, the conceptually necessary operation required to grasp the specific nature of modern forms of wealth is inverted into a mere reflection upon ahistorical contents. What he faults Mara for, namely a lack of conceptual, quote, rigor, in failing to distinguish clearly enough between intellectual abstraction, value with transhistorical content, and real abstraction, commodity value with historically specific content, is nothing but his own categorical conflation of the transhistorical content of value determination, the content of the value form, and historically specific value substance, abstract labor as a historically specific form, instead of clearly elucidating the ambivalence inherent in Marx's determination of value substance. He merely constructs yet another ambivalence, one which he then imputes to Marx. Unlike Mueller, Klaus Holtz correctly recognizes that the value not yet manifested in exchange, which Marx terms a, quote, thought thing, is indeed commodity value. However, he too falls prey to Marx's terminology regarding the, quote, content of value determination, end quote, and consequently dehistoricizes the form of value. Drawing upon the Robinson Crusoe section within the chapter on commodity fetishism, the status of which, in terms of the logic of presentation, remains obscure to Holtz, as it does to so many other interpreters, he asserts that, according to Marx, Robinson's products of labor possessed, quote, value, but no value form, and thus no commodity form, end quote. In reality, however, Marx states that in the very fact that Robinson expends specific quantities of labor time to produce specific use values, the average magnitude of which must necessarily concern him if he is to survive, quote, all the essential determinations of value are contained, end quote. Yet this potentially misleading formulation merely refers to the state of affairs that Marx sought to capture, just a few pages earlier with the concept of the, quote, content of value determination, end quote. According to this view, value is the historically specific form of social labor, a content that exists in all social formations characterized by a division of labor, namely the necessity for humans to labor for one another in specific proportions. To begin with, this demonstrates just how deliberately flawed the Robinson Crusoe example is from the outset. Furthermore, it becomes evident that value is not itself a, quote, content in a transhistorical sense, as Holtz implicitly assumes, but rather the form of a transhistorical content. Specifically, the expenditure of labor time in the production of goods and the socialization of labor. In passages from his Notes on Wagner, which Holtz himself had cited extensively just a few pages earlier, Marx articulates this point with perfect clarity, quote, that the, quote, value of the commodity merely expresses, in a historically developed form, that which likewise exists in all other historical social formations, albeit in a different form, namely the social character of labor, insofar as it exists as the expenditure of, quote, social labor power, end quote. While Holtz rightly notes that commodity value, though logically prior, cannot be real without a value form, meaning that essence, commodity value, and form of appearance, value form, are empirically, quote, co-original, and that the individual commodity exhibits an immanent contradiction between commodity value and use value only insofar as this contradiction is already manifested externally in exchange, a point that simultaneously reduces any historicizing interpretation to absurdity. His thesis that, in the absence of a value form, value determination therefore, quote, depends immediately upon concrete labor itself, unquote, is untenable. Here too, under the guise of, quote, clarifying Marx, a hopeless conceptual confusion is being perpetrated. It unnecessarily bifurcates the concept of value into, quote, product value, parenthesis, distinct from use value, exclamation point, and parenthesis, and, quote, commodity value, thereby suggesting the possibility of a substantialist, ahistorical theory of value, one supposedly capable of analyzing even, quote, subsistence production through the lens of labor value theory, end quote. It is hardly a matter of mere speculation whether this, quote, attempt at clarification, end quote, too, is secretly underpinned by assertions regarding the physical determinacy of the value substance. Evidently, Holt seeks to forcibly reconcile the labor value doctrine, which he interprets as entirely, quote, form indifferent, end quote, i.e., quote, labor creates value, end quote, strictly in the spirit of classical economics, with Marx's social labor value theory. A further variation in the conceptualization of the nature of abstract labor can be found in Christian Eber's systematic commentary on Volume 1 of Capital. Initially, he attempts to ground the character of value not merely as a horizontal relation between commodities and exchange, but also as a vertical relation to social labor, in the fact that the, quote, purpose of the commodity as a product intended for exchange, quote, is already taken into account during its production, end quote. While here the subjective, albeit not arbitrary, since they are conditioned by the relations of production, purposive determinations of the producers within the immediate act of production are elevated to the status of the ground of value. Eber's determination of the value substance abstract labor takes a different form just a few pages later, countering a circulation-centric conception of, quote, real abstraction, which views the value substance as the result of the act of equating commodities in exchange. He insists that Marx's formulation of the character of abstract labor as the expenditure of brain, muscle, and nerve be understood as the adequate determination of the value substance. Abstract labor is therefore a, quote, socially induced naturalization, end quote, of concrete labor, which is thereby, quote, tendentially reduced to expenditure in the sense of the wearing out of natural bodily forces, end quote. The very example cited by Eber from the Grundrisse, in which Marx speaks of, quote, indifference toward a specific kind of labor, end quote, presupposing a universal social division of labor, wherein immediate producers, quote, pass with ease from one labor to another, and the specific kind of labor is accidental to them, hence indifferent, end quote, gives rise to the concern that Eber is thereby conflating abstract labor with a specific sort of concrete labor, namely de-skilled manual activity, or at the very least with concrete labor in general. Thus, abstract and concrete labor are no longer two distinct sorts of labor. Instead, they become one and the same. When Eber asserts that it is the, quote, dominance of value over social labor, which renders social labor abstract human, because it practically ensures that labor must remain indifferent to its own character as concrete useful labor, quote, the confusion is only further compounded. Here that which was just moments ago supposed to be the product of the value ground, abstract labor, namely value itself, is suddenly declared to be the cause of its own cause, a fallacious circle that can surely have nothing to do with dialectics. Rather, a logical and historical result of the real subsumption of the labor process under capital, is being enlisted to serve as the logical explanation for value. One second, sorry, I'm just making sure I'm finding my place within the text itself. Within the framework of his reconstruction of Marx's theory of value, Moishe does indeed recognize a tension between a universal historical physiological and a socially specific determination of abstract labor in Marx's Capital, and Pastone vehemently rejects the former. Rubin, he asserts, echoing Rubin, he asserts that abstract labor is either a physiological determination or a historically specific category. Yet Pastone's assessment of this contradiction remains ambiguous. Pastone initially believes he discerns in Marx's Capital a strategy of, quote, immanent presentation, end quote, regarding the dual character of commodity-producing labor. Consequently, in his analysis of the commodity, Marx is said to introduce, quote, forms of thought that are characteristic of the society whose fundamental social forms he is critically analyzing, end quote. As a result, the categories found at the beginning of the critique of political economy are allegedly, quote, already presented in a mystified form, end quote. The foundational determinations of abstract labor, for instance, appearing as transhistorical. Since under capitalism, that which is historically specific, the synthetic function of labor, manifests itself as something ontological, i.e. as an inherent property of labor, qua metabolic process between humans and nature. Pastone argues that Marx's exposition, conceived as a, quote, analysis of capitalism in its own terms, end quote, must initially incorporate this physiological ontological determination, only to subsequently deconstruct it in the course of the exposition. Due to this very immanence, the critique of political economy is, according to Pastone, easily liable to be misconstrued as a positive, affirmative political economy. Yet alongside these theses, which find scant further corroboration in the literature, Pastone nonetheless finds, quote, the determination of abstract labor, as Marx elaborates them in Chapter 1 of Capital, to be extremely problematic, end quote. Pastone. He is unable, however, to bring himself to acknowledge the existence of actual contradictions and ambivalences within Capital, the book. In this context, it defies logic to deem the initial determinations of the abstract work, quote, extremely problematic, end quote, and contrary to the systematic intentions of Marx's Capital, while simultaneously positing them as a necessary moment of a sophisticated critique of objective thought forms. It appears that Pastone himself is unsure of his own diagnosis. Ultimately, however, he opts for the theorem of immanent critique, a device that now serves him to elide potential ambiguities in Marx. The initial categories, he suggests, were fundamentally and deliberately presented by Marx in a distorted manner, precisely so that they could be subjected to critique later on. Any other assumption, Pastone argues, would impute to Marx, quote, an inexplicable degree of inconsistency, end quote. Since Pastone does not endeavor to further elaborate his remarks regarding the Marxian program, conceived as an exposition serving as a critique of economic categories, yet this interpretation is largely identical to Helmut Brentel's thesis concerning the initial categories of the critique of political economy as, quote, consciously thematicized and provoked misunderstandings, end quote. The question of the plausibility of this interpretation shall be discussed here by taking Brentel's work as an example. Brentel's well-substantiated fundamental thesis posits that the progression of the exposition in Capital, the book, is by no means a conceptually rigorous reconstruction of a historical development. Rather, it constitutes a logical, formal, critical regression into the very ground of the initial categories which thereby shed the false appearance of their self-groundedness, naturalness, immediacy, and harmony. Form analysis, quote, presents the categories of political economy, initially conceived as simple and autonomous, as abstractions of a comprehensive context, through which alone they can be constituted as such. End quote. This can be demonstrated, for instance, by examining the concept of exchange value in Chapter 1. It is initially introduced as a merely quantitative ratio of use values. That is precisely as it appears to the abstraction of political economy when viewed from the standpoint of immediate everyday experience, and as it appears inter alia in the theory of Samuel Bailey. Yet on the very next page, via the argument regarding commensurability, it is exposed as logically inconsistent. This in turn necessarily necessitates the introduction of the category of an immanent value. It is, however, worth noting that Marx, through his specific choice of words, already draws attention to the illusory character of this initial determination of exchange value. Using phrases such as, quote, appears initially, or, quote, seems therefore, end quote, and immediately thereafter proceeds to examine, quote, the matter more closely, end quote, and set the record straight. Now Brentel, much like Pistone, argues that Marx consciously employs this very procedure with regard to the determination of the substance of value, namely abstract labor. Here, recourse is first taken to the substantialist labor theories of value, such as those of Ricardo or Proudhon, in order subsequently to demonstrate, following Pistone, and primarily with reference to the chapter on fetishism, the historicity and purely social specificity of this, quote, substance. Why, however, Marx, in his, quote, introduction of the reified political economic definition of value substance in chapter 1.2 writes, not, quote, all labor seems, end quote, but rather, quote, all labor is the expenditure of human labor power in the physiological sense, and in this quality it forms the value of commodities, end quote. And only several pages later, without any reference to this earlier passage, presents a non-naturalistic determination, remains unclear within this interpretive framework. How then does Pistone define abstract labor and value? Quote, in commodity-producing society, end quote, labor becomes the means by which the producer appropriates goods created by others. A product becomes a commodity by virtue of representing a use value for others and an exchange value for the producer. The producer's labor thereby acquires a dual character. Quote, on the one hand, it is a specific kind of labor that produces particular products for others, end quote, which constitutes the social character of concrete labor. And on the other hand, quote, labor serves the producer, independently of its particular content, as a means to acquire the products of others, end quote. In the capitalist mode of production, the existence of which is presupposed in this account, quote, labor becomes a means to acquire goods in a very particular way, end quote. Quote, with regard to the products that buyers acquire thanks to their labor, they abstract from the particularity of the producer's labor. There exists no internal relationship between the specific nature of the labor expended and the specific nature of the product acquired by means of that labor, end quote. Insofar as it produces use values, labor is to be understood as a concretely purposeful activity, as a metabolic process between human beings and nature. The, quote, function of labor as a socially mediating activity, end quote, by contrast, is captured in the concept of abstract labor. Labor under capitalism is thus beyond its concretely useful dimension, a medium of social mediation. The commodity is not merely an object of use, but also a means, the social form of the private product. Value, furthermore, constitutes a purely social category of mediation, a, quote, self-distributing form of wealth, unquote. Labor under capitalism can therefore be defined as that which is socialized, concrete labor, and simultaneously as that which socializes abstract labor. In contrast to this synthesis, the synthesis of the concrete through abstract labor, non-capitalist modes of production feature an external mediation, a, quote, social distribution of labor and its products based on a wide variety of customs, traditional ties, transparent power relations, or conscious decisions, end quote. Through this embedding of productive activity within a, quote, matrix of manifest social relations, end quote, labors are determined solely as, quote, qualitatively distinct, end quote. They become symbolically charged, and as such, in their natural form, are socialized through forms of direct interaction. Material wealth as the result of concrete labor does not in itself constitute a social nexus. Paradoxically, however, abstract labor is at one moment defined as a, quote, function of labor as a socially mediating activity, end quote, while at another it is held to be, quote, the social function of labor, end quote, that quote, renders labor general, end quote. In one instance, the synthetic function of labor, being identical with abstract labor, serves as the explanandum. In another, the mediating function serves as the, quote, serves as the explanans, with the abstractness of labor becoming the explanandum. Pistone's contribution, too, lacks desirable clarity in answering the question of precisely where the, quote, real abstraction from concrete labors takes place, whether in the sphere of exchange and or within the immediate process of production. Given that the aforementioned explanation of abstract labor as a function of socialization, derived from its own function of socialization, is not exactly satisfactory, and given further that Alfred Sohn-Rettel is criticized for positing that value abstraction constitutes, quote, not an abstraction of labor, but an abstraction of exchange, not an abstraction of labor, but an abstraction of exchange, end quote. Pistone appears to favor the immediate process of production as the primary source of abstraction. However, this approach, which, as Norbert Trenkle observes, remains, quote, consistently at the level of labor itself, end quote, entails the problematic consequences that value must be grounded in the direct relationship between human beings and things. Thus, a formulation such as the claim that producers, quote, abstract from the particularity of their labors, end quote, could be interpreted as reducing abstract labor to the mere result of a conscious, parenthesis, or alternatively unconscious, albeit still mental, in parenthesis, act of abstraction on the part of the actors involved, that is, to a socially imposed nominal abstraction. This is, in fact, precisely the approach attempted by Robert Kurtz. Sorry, one second. He begins by speaking of a, quote, aporia within the Marxist concept of labor, the Marxian concept of labor, one that lies in the determination of labor as, quote, a capitalist real abstraction and simultaneously as an ontological principle, end quote. This differentiation, which is itself already rooted in an ontology of labor, is ultimately lost within Marxism in favor of a, quote, transhistorical conception of abstract labor, itself a real abstraction. It thus establishes an ontology of labor of the second power. Against this sublimation of the Marxian distinction into the transhistorical realm, Kurtz now attempts to dissolve it entirely into the historical, specifically the form-analytical distinction between concrete and abstract labor, as presented in Marx's Capital, is in this process to be undone and assigned unreservedly to the side of form. Concrete labor itself is, therefore, to be deciphered as a capitalist real abstraction. Kurtz initially seeks to demonstrate this by examining the categories of concrete labor and use value, categories introduced by Marx as the material content of wealth, regardless of its specific social form. Both, Kurtz argues, are, quote, real paradoxes, and, quote, insofar themselves constitute constituents of modern real abstraction, end quote, since within them, whether as, quote, concrete labor or, quote, abstract utility, quote, the attribute stands in contradiction to the concept, end quote. Quote, use value, he claims, is nothing other than an abstract, quote, potential for use, simpliciter, end quote, severed from consumption within the circulation process, a claim that raises the question of what then constitutes the, quote, concrete utility that manifests itself in actual use. Conversely, quote, abstract labor, Kurtz suggests, is a pleonasm. This line of reasoning becomes even more adventurous here when Kurtz turns to the function of the use value of a commodity, standing in the equivalent form. Here, Kurtz argues, it is the, quote, abstractified use value body, end quote, of this commodity that expresses the, quote, exchange value, by which he likely means the value of those commodities currently standing in the relative form of value. Thus, the, quote, paradox of commodity society, the literal corporeal manifestation of the abstraction, end quote, of value, comes to light. In this context, reference is made to the, quote, tier, bracket animal, and bracket passage from the first edition of Marx's Capital, which is thereby interpreted as an instance of conceptual realism or, quote, real metaphysics. The value form, specifically in the guise of the money form, consequently generates a genuine fusion of matter and form, the actualization of the abstract. Kurtz bolsters this argument with the assertion that the objective dimension of the money commodity is now, quote, no longer a sensuous material. Its content has itself become the abstract form, end quote. Indeed, this brand of irrationalism has subsequently gained traction within the discourse surrounding the Crisis Journal. Quote, paradox, quote, mysticism, and, quote, real metaphysics are unhesitatingly marshaled as descriptions of the reality of modern forms of wealth. Self-fabricated logical contradictions are presented in an apocalyptic tone as the objective destiny of the socialization of value. According to Kurtz, both concrete and abstract labor, conceived as supposedly transhistorical categories, ultimately designate a, quote, specific material mode of access of abstract labor to natural or social matter, end quote. The nominal abstractions, quote, concrete labor, and, quote, use value, appear to dissolve, almost without remainder, into the real abstractions, which, however, as remains to be shown, are for Kurtz, quote, real, only insofar as they pertain to the substance of value, namely, abstract labor and value. This is evident when he asserts that use value is, quote, merely a form of appearance of value, and that concrete labor is, quote, actually abstract. Even at this level, Kurtz's attempt to deontologization proves to be an absurd undertaking, one that must ultimately end in a regressus ad infinitum, or in sheer irrationalism. To begin with, a form analytical strategy, one aiming to identify historically specific modes of organizing material reproduction, requires a distinction between form and content. The latter must be conceived as abstracts and transhistorical, valid across all modes of production. It must be abstract because concrete labor and use value, as specific events and objects emerging within history, are always already historically and singularly shaped. E.g., concrete labor might take the form of tailoring in 19th century England. However, these specific aspects are of no immediate concern. At subsequent levels of exposition regarding the economic object, use value becomes relevant to the analysis in a different respect. For here, the social form and the objective material dimension enter into a relationship specific to a particular social formation, as representatives of the historically social within the material realm, forms of value, as use value that creates value for capital, the use value of the commodity labor power, and as a labor process tailored to the process of valorization, real subsumption. Yet despite this non-neutrality of the singular material, or the formation-specific material level, within the more complex levels of exposition found in the critique of political economy, this material level never becomes identical with the level of form. In Marx's work, the material content of production and its products is taken into account via form analysis only, quote, when it is modified by the formal relations, or when it appears as modifying them, end quote. Thus, it is only through the analytical distinction between the dimensions of form and matter that the historically specific form of wealth, value, can be recognized, and its form-specific imprint upon labor processes and products can be deciphered. This separation and correlation is, therefore, anything but an inconsistency, contrary to what Kurtz believes he can impute to Postone. Kurtz argues that it is legitimate to speak of labor in a transformational sense only if it also exists as, quote, pure labor within the capitalist mode of production, thereby entirely missing the point of this analytical differentiation. If one views concrete labor as Kurtz does as a contradictio in adjecto, yet wishes to adhere to a theory of form, one is compelled to find a different category for that which is form unspecific. Thus, in Kurtz's work, the term, quote, activity is used instead of, quote, concrete labor, and, quote, matter instead of, quote, use value. However, these two are general concepts for something that is in each instance concrete and distinctly determined. Consequently, albeit solely on the basis of the highly questionable premise that these are merely abstractions, they too could be interpreted as nothing more than results of capitalist, quote, real abstraction. Ultimately, through such a, quote, critique of enlightenment, end quote, all abstractions and thereby all concepts and all acts of conceptualization would be discredited. Here Kurtz appears to adopt the standpoint of, quote, sensuous certainty, end quote, which Hegel critiques in the Phenomenology of Spirit. In contrast, and long before Kurtz's reflections on the critique of abstraction, as well as in a fundamentally different manner, Gerhard Stapelfeld drew attention to the, quote, problematic nature of the concept of use value, end quote, or more precisely, of the concrete labor that produces use values. Namely, the dilemma of, quote, being required to name precisely that which is distinct, yet being able to articulate it only as that which is not distinct, end quote. The sensuously singular can be expressed only through the medium of language, and therefore it can be expressed only in general terms. The process of abstraction within exchange, he argues, excludes use value because the latter, quote, names that which is distinct and therefore fails to indicate that which is common, end quote. Therefore, the common, quote, third term of commodities, that which enables their exchange, cannot be a mysterious, quote, use value per se, end quote, the product of an equally mysterious, quote, useful labor per se, end quote. For use values are always created through the relationship of a human being to a real and entirely specific piece of nature. Consequently, while, quote, concrete labor is indeed a general concept, it invariably denotes only concrete specific activities such as weaving or tailoring, which of course are themselves merely general concepts. Quote, labor producing use values, insofar as it is inextricably bound to natural matter, precisely cannot be conceived as an identity. It is as diverse as its products, end quote. It is here that the distinction from the concept of, quote, abstract labor is grounded. To begin with, the object of this latter concept is indeed an abstraction, one derived from the concrete, yet it is not an abstraction that merely, quote, names something else, end quote, but rather one that is something in itself, the social relation. Thus, whereas, quote, concrete labor names a particular entity, yet necessarily fails to grasp it as a particular entity, quote, abstract labor denotes something equally abstract, yet, quote, hits the mark, end quote, precisely. As a, quote, double abstraction, Kurtz seeks to have, quote, labor simpliciter, end quote, understood as a socio-structural phenomenon in such a way that, alongside the violent aggregation of the most diverse activities into, quote, labor simpliciter, a separation of these activities from the rest of human life processes simultaneously takes place. Labor thus constitutes itself as a real abstraction, because the, quote, commodity producing human, quote, abstracts, not only from the sensuous quality of his objects, but in and with regard to, quote, labor, simultaneously from other moments of life, end quote. This aspect of the separation of spheres, allegedly neglected by Marx, takes center stage in Kurtz's efforts to formulate a, quote, production-centered theory of real abstraction of labor. According to Kurtz, within the, quote, abstract space-time of business economics, end quote, characterized by the detachment of the workplace from other life processes, i.e. the constitution of the factory, and by an abstracted homogeneous time, three processes of abstraction are generated: the abstraction of workers from their needs, the content and form of the industrial labor process are heteronomously imposed upon human beings, the abstraction of the actors from one another during the act of production, parenthesis, the, quote, the economic, quote, functional space, end quote, is not their living space, in parenthesis, and the abstraction from the quality of the labor products, parenthesis, the object to be produced is, quote, indifferent and alien, end quote, to the producers, end parenthesis. However, this enumeration, strongly reminiscent of the description of the characteristics of alienated labor found in the Paris manuscripts, actually amounts to an examination of the consequences of the commodification of labor power, the reorientation of material production towards profit production as an end in itself, and consequently, the disembedding of the economy, understood as the exchange-mediated appropriation of others' labor power, from forms of, quote, moral economy, or directly domination-based appropriation. None of these processes of abstraction constitutes value as an economic form. Kurtz's project of historicization takes an interesting turn in its treatment of the category of abstract labor. He too argues against the thesis advanced by Heinrich and Pastone that Marx's determination of the substance of value as the expenditure of, quote, brain, muscle, and nerve, end quote, constitutes a naturalistic dehistoricization. While it is true, Kurtz contends, that traditional Marxism did indeed naturalize abstract labor, Heinrich's critique of this naturalization is, in Kurtz's view, no longer capable of conceptually grasping the quantitative dimension of the substance of value. Quote, for something to be capable of increase or decrease, it must be substantially present in a truly material, contentual sense. A mere form acting as a substance cannot constitute a quantitative relation, end quote. Abstract labor, understood as the mere expenditure of human energy, cannot, in terms of its material substance, be separated from the concrete form of that same energy. This separation, Kurtz argues, occurs as a non-natural process within the capitalist, quote, labor abstraction, end quote. A process whose residual outcome, however, remains a, quote, thoroughly material content, end quote. The, quote, reduction of the physiological combustion process, end quote, that specific expenditure of human labor within a given time frame which alone is of interest in the process of value formation, is, according to Kurtz, therefore, quote, a social abstraction, end quote. That this approach yields very little in terms of clarifying the value-forming function of abstract labor will now be demonstrated by an examination of Kurtz's substantialist, quote, theory of labor abstraction, end quote, regarding value. Here, Kurtz's complete disregard for the logical sequence of categories in Marx's Capital proves particularly fatal, for he dissolves the specifically social form of labor, abstract labor, and of products, value, into a mere relation between material processes in the objective physical sense on the one hand and acts of thought on the other. Since the physical processes of energy expenditure identified with abstract labor are, quote, a thing of the past and no longer tangible, end quote, once the products have been manufactured, the representation of value substance as a value property of products can occur, quote, only in the minds, end quote, of the actors, as a, quote, fetishized practical perception and, quote, treatment of their own sociality, end quote. In an earlier text, Kurtz endeavors to provide a more detailed justification of this thesis within the framework of the, quote, theory of labor abstraction, end quote. Kurtz aims to trace the constitution of value entirely independently of the sphere of circulation, explaining in terms of a, quote, double separation and disconnectedness, end quote, of the immediate producer, one, from the, quote, consumptive purpose of his own production, end quote, he produces use values for others, and two, from the labor of others which is privately isolated. By virtue of the first separation, the labor of producer A is, quote, for him, abstract labor, and his product is an objectification of value. By virtue of the second separation, the products and labors of other producers assume this same character. In order to substantiate, by reference to Marx, the transformation of abstract labor into a subjectively felt indifference toward one's own labor and that of others, an indifference brought about by the separation of production, consumption, and producers, as well as the identification of value constitution and the perception of one's own objects and those of others as mutually exchangeable entities. Kurtz treats Marx's remarks regarding the analytical method and the theoretical level of abstraction employed in the exposition of economic objectification as definitive descriptions of that very objectification. Marx's reflection on the abstraction, necessitated by the mode of presentation, is unceremoniously transplanted into the unconscious of the commodity owners, thereby transforming the real abstraction, which takes place within the social relation of private products, into a socially imposed nominal abstraction. For Kurtz, value is either a thing, a notion he rejects, or a thought, specifically, quote, something existing unconsciously in the minds of human beings, ... a mere mental construct, end quote. Kurtz. Value is held to be simultaneously a, quote, hieroglyph for past labor, which Kurtz conceives of as material, and a, quote, reified semblance, end quote, whereby value and fetish are ultimately conflated. Value is thus a, quote, social phantom image, end quote, of past labor exertion, projected onto the product. While Kurtz acknowledges that value emerges only in money, he simultaneously insists that it must constantly appear to the producer as inherent in his product, even prior to exchange. For the producers themselves, their labors are indeed abstract. They abstract from use values. If the individual producer is to create value, through his, quote, abstract labor, as well as his acts of abstraction and projection, even before entering into socially mediated contact via exchange, then the commodity, at the very outset of the exposition in Marx's Capital, must necessarily appear as an isolated object, already possessing the objective reality of value in and of itself. But how does something appear, value in the commodity, without truly appearing, value in money? How does the mechanism of projection function, given that, according to Kurtz, abstract labor is by no means something, quote, internal that can be mirrored outward? How can value, as a social universal, exist a priori in the minds of producers? How is it socially valid, socially valid representation within one and the same commodity to be explained, starting from such unconscious mental acts on the part of individuals? How can abstract human labor, and in this form socially universal labor, already exist within the individual act of production itself, when private labor, as such, has not yet been socially recognized? Kurtz offers no answer to any of these questions. Between 1987 and 2004, Kurtz neither deepened nor revised his abstruse, quote, psychoanalysis of value. For an approach that has mutated into a metaphorical, falutin-style Marxism, and for its adherents, the mere use of undigested buzzwords such as, quote, fetish constitution, is evidently deemed sufficient. This is regrettable, for behind the now extremely embittered style of Kurtz's text, a style that barely attempts to conceal his past as a Marxist-Leninist, lie hidden almost to the point of vanishing, intriguing indications of a critique of traditional Marxism, thus countering the thesis formulated by Rubin and Wolff, which posits the abstract labor holds relevance for socialization in the sense of the social equalization of concrete labors within pre-capitalist modes of production for the purpose of the proportional distribution of total social labor. He observes that the very concept of, quote, equal or, quote, abstract labor is nonsensical if concrete labors already function as such as constituent elements of that total labor. Drawing upon Postone, he points out that pre-modern conceptions of time are ill-suited for the conscious equalization of disparate activities, for in such contexts, time is qualitatively defined precisely as a variable that is task-oriented and contingent upon specific events. Indeed, the very methods used to measure time are predicated upon qualitatively distinct events or upon variable units of time. If every activity and every event possesses its own inherent temporality, then there can exist no evident independent, quantitatively uniform magnitude to which these activities might be reduced, or again which they might be compared. However, with the sole exception of the reflections on the concept of time derived from Postone, the critique does not extend beyond the sparse observations previously offered by Brentel and Heinrich. Furthermore, as has already been demonstrated, the critique of the more expansive theorem regarding a, quote, socialist law of value, end quote, can be found as early as 1977 in the work of Kit Steiner. However, the rhapsodic and arbitrary manner in which the sequence of presentation in Marx's Capital is treated forms the defining background of Kurtz's reflections. It is not solely through his misinterpretations of the form analytical distinction and the, quote, thought thing passage in the first chapter of the first edition that it becomes evident that Kurtz seeks, so to speak, to possess all the insights of the critique of political economy at once, and to find them already present within the very first pages of the exposition. Thus, he does not understand the method of, quote, ascending from the abstract to the concrete, end quote, as a means of systematically explaining more complex phenomena, such as money, by deriving them from simpler non-empirical elements. Rather, he interprets it as a reduction of value, an abstract entity, back to, quote, real living labor, end quote. Consequently, this process of, quote, ascending comes to an end after merely the first 3 pages of Capital. In doing so, Kurtz conflates the analytical progression leading from the commodity to value, and thence to the dual character of labor, with the synthetic progression of ascending from the abstract to the concrete. Furthermore, the question arises as to what, quote, real and, quote, living are intended to signify, if not metaphors drawn from the philosophy of life. This metaphorical Marxism is also evident in his, quote, reconstruction of Marx. Here, Marxian metaphors are unhesitatingly taken at face value. When Marx, in the course of his theoretical deduction, moving from exchange value to value, states that the act of abstracting from use value, an act performed at this level of exposition solely by, quote, us as scientific observers, quote, extinguishes the sensuous properties of objects, causing their useful character to, quote, vanish. Kurt simply reinterprets this as a description of the, quote, ideal destructive potential of value, end quote. Specifically, its, quote, life-annihilating quality, end quote. However, neither in the analytical abstraction from the use-value qualities of commodities performed by the theorist Marx, nor in the real abstraction of the actual act of exchange is use value destroyed. Rather, a reduction to a social property lying beyond use value is effected, so that qualitatively distinct things may be exchanged, that is, quantitatively equated. The real autonomization of value within capital, which indeed subsequently generates destructive effects upon the material dimension of socialization, is neither attained nor intended here. Much like Kurtz, and in explicit contrast to Heinrich, Ralph Kremer interprets the contentious passage in Marx as an indication that under capitalism, quote, workers establish a claim to a corresponding return based on the expenditure of their living labor power and time, end quote. Ralph Kremer. Yet, it is Marx's concern in the second subsection of the first chapter, truly with claims and their legitimation, and on the part, yet is Marx's concern in the second subsection of the first chapter truly with claims and their legitimation on the part of the producers. Kremer posits precisely this within the framework of a broader attempt to conceptualize value and value substance, drawing from Klaus Holzkamp's critical psychology as, quote, social object and means significance, end quote. Such significances, he argues, are generated by the functions objects fulfill within social practices. They are neither subjective attributions made by individuals, nor natural properties inherent to the objects themselves. What holds true regarding the use-value dimension of things, namely that specific objects are assessed as useful only within the context of specific practices, e.g. a stone as a hand axe, a goose quill as a writing pen, etc., holds true, by extension, for their social significance as means for appropriating a share of total social labor. Products of labor acquire this significance on the basis of capitalist relations of production and exchange, a process that simultaneously constitutes the concrete labors performed by the producers as value substance. Value is thus, according to this view, a claim to shares of the social product, formulated within the sphere of exchange, that is, quote, ultimately grounded in the necessary labor performed in production, which thereby qualifies as value substance. According to Kremer, these determinations represent objective, i.e., socially generated, significances that are subjectively appropriated by commodity owners. They are present in the owner's consciousness and are held to, quote, physically regulate, end quote, quote, psychically regulate, end quote, their actions, even within the immediate process of production. Thus, under capitalism, actors engage in production not merely through the mental anticipation of the use values they intend to bring forth, the mental prefiguration of the useful form that things assume within the context of a specific practice, but also through the mental anticipation of these goods as commodities produced for the specific purpose of exchange. Yet, precisely how this intersubjective production of meaning actually unfolds remains as obscure as the posited, quote, presence of value meaning within the individual psyches of commodity producers, a presence that stands in stark contradiction to the very lack of awareness regarding the true character of the social principle of unity underlying products and labor created through a private division of labor. In this regard, it is Kremer himself who consistently contradicts his own initial theses. While a diffuse notion of a commodity's, quote, value, one that supposedly, quote, expresses itself, unquote, in money, may indeed exist within common sense understanding, this linguistically articulated value meaning is in fact, quote, highly fetishized, and is erroneously attributed to the material properties of the commodities themselves. It is repeatedly emphasized that it is price, rather than value, that holds, quote, immediate significance, unquote, for the subjects involved, or conversely, the capitalists assert their claims to profit realization, that is, their claims to a share of the aggregate social value product, by citing their total costs, rather than by appealing to the concrete labor they have actually expended. Well, it is certainly correct to note that this reliance on costs as the determinant of prices and profits does nothing to alter the fact that, quote, in the final analysis, relations of socially necessary labor time lie at the very foundation of this process, end quote. This observation can, in fact, be interpreted as a counter-argument to the thesis that value meanings are somehow, quote, present within the psyches of commodity owners. The fact that the concrete labor time expended during production is of interest to every capitalist, as well as every small-scale commodity producer, and is regarded as a factor in anticipated profit, alters nothing regarding the fact that the basis of general exchangeability remains unknown to these actors, and that they calculate in terms of prices, that is, in terms of imagined quantities of the money commodity. Kremer can thus be counted among those interpreters who conflate the monetary profit expectations of commodity producers formed within the immediate production process with the existence of value as an economic quality. We have seen thus far that even within the logical systematic paradigm of a new reading of Marx, a tendency prevails to define the concepts of value and or abstract labor in isolation from the order of presentation in Marx's Capital, and to make sense of specific formulations by Marx in a way that tends toward, on the one hand, a reifying resubstantialization of form-theoretical categories, and on the other, their cognitive volatilization. Dieter Wolff's approach, by contrast, claims to dismantle these dualisms and to bring about the original, historically specific objectivity of economic forms, alongside concrete useful labor, conceived as a, quote, eternally valid metabolic process between human beings and nature, end quote. He distinguishes three levels of meaning for the concept of, quote, abstract labor. First, the concept is employed in the sense of a nominal abstraction, by means of a, quote, abstraction performed by the observer, end quote. The particularity of specific types of labor is disregarded, and they are reduced to their common characteristic of being, quote, expenditures of human labor power, simpliciter, end quote. However, this conceptual fixation of abstract human labor, vis-a-vis concrete forms of activity, must be sharply distinguished from the real autonomization of the former vis-a-vis the latter. Unlike concrete useful labor, abstract labor entails, quote, no productive engagement with various natural materials, end quote. Thus, even when viewed as a nominal abstraction, one abstracts from any productive engagement with natural materials, whereas in the case of defining concrete labor as a metabolic process between human beings and nature, one abstracts only, quote, from the particularities of the material, not from materiality itself. That is, not from the productive engagement with natural materials, end quote. Consequently, according to Wolff, abstract labor is precisely not to be defined as, quote, concrete labor in general. Concrete labor in general, quote. Not even in its transhistorical dimension. It is only the conflation of these two dimensions that, according to Wolff, warrants criticism as being substantialist. All, quote, naturalizing attempts at substantialization, end quote, of abstract labor are therefore, quote, doomed to failure, end quote, because they conceive of abstract labor as a specific kind of labor, specifically as a form of concrete labor involving the human interaction with nature, rather than as a general attribute. In contrast, Wolff, following Marx, explicitly emphasizes that concrete and abstract labor are, quote, not two different sorts of labor, end quote. Consequently, only concrete useful labors ever exist independently. Abstract labor, in this primary sense, is thus, quote, an abstract general attribute that is neither sensually perceptible nor possesses an independent sensuous existence, end quote. Wolff. The formulation by Marx, which has been the subject of criticism in the approaches examined thus far, stating that abstract labor, as the substance of value, represents the, quote, expenditure of labor power in a physiological sense, end quote, must therefore not be read literally as a naturalistic definition. Quote, the expenditure of human labor power, even in its physiological determination, contains nothing of a natural material nature that passes from the human being into some object distinct from himself. Absent a productive engagement with various natural materials, it is not a natural process either, one in which merely chemical physical processes occur within the, quote, brain, consuming energy, activating muscles, secreting sweat, moving hands to touch something, and so forth, end quote. Wolff. The very notion of a, quote, expenditure of abstract human labor is therefore rejected by Wolff as well. Concrete labor, he argues, can be, quote, expended, since concrete labor alone constitutes actual labor engaged in interaction with nature. Wolff's attempt to render the, quote, physiological passage, end quote, from capital compatible with a form analytical framework, thereby challenging substantialist interpretations, may be characterized as original. Here he proposes first to interpret abstract human labor as a, quote, non-sensuous general property, end quote, of concrete labors, which cannot empirically exist as such, and second, to conceive of this property as the bearer of an equally non-sensuous social significance, conditioned by exchange in the sense of relating labor products to one another as products of human labor simpliciter. Wolff's thesis, however, that in the, quote, physiology passage, end quote, Marx delineates the dual character of labor, quote, with all necessary clarity, end quote, must be rejected. While it is indeed absurd to assume that Marx would here articulate twice in succession the same, quote, physiological fact, unquote, namely that of concrete labor in general, and moreover contrast this within the very same sentence, quote, on the other hand, the expenditure of human labor in the physiological sense, on the other, the expenditure of human labor power in a special purposive form, unquote. It is precisely this second step which Wolff deems necessary, and which would serve to rescue this sentence from a naturalistic interpretation, that Marx at this juncture fails to take. There is no indication here of the social significance of abstract human labor as a value substance, a signification that is, in reality, brought about solely through the process of exchange. Furthermore, reference is made to the quote, expenditure of an abstract non-sensuous attribute, a formulation that further fuels an empiricist interpretation. Wolff attempts to salvage his argument by positing that Marx, in employing all the categories mentioned here, as well as others such as, quote, jelly, in relation to the objective reality of value, was attempting a, quote, circumscription, end quote, of abstract labor as value substance, parenthesis, or conversely of value as a social objective reality. That could not, quote, fully do justice to the non-sensuous social character, end quote, of these phenomena. In doing so, he not only contradicts his own thesis regarding the clarity and ambiguity of Marx's exposition, but also advances the profoundly skeptical epistemological claim that, quote, what actually transpires within the social relation obtaining between commodities, i.e. products of labor, with regard to the origin of value, end quote, is, quote, not truly communicable through language, except by recourse to the literary realm, to poetic fantasy, finding expression in metaphor, end quote. Thus Wolff places himself, at least at first glance, in close proximity to positions such as that of Heinz-Dieter Kitzsteiner. He posits that the translation of metaphors of the philosophy of history into concepts of the critique of political economy cannot be fully accomplished as long as the, quote, fundamental problem that these metaphors designate, the, quote, spontaneous naturalness, end quote, of the historical process, end quote, persists. For both Wolff and Kitzsteiner, value would therefore be describable only by means of, quote, absolute metaphors, end quote, those referring to a, quote, foreign process that cannot be directly generated, end quote. Whereas complete clarity, achieved through conceptual analysis, would have to remain reserved for objects intentionally brought forth by human beings. In a further step, Wolff now posits, in contrast to merely conceptual abstraction, a real social function of abstract labor that is not specific to any particular social formation. Accordingly, it is the very process of the proportional distribution of total social labor across individual branches of production, in which specific concrete labors are mutually related to one another as abstract human labor. Quote, labors are qualitatively equated as constituent elements of total social labor because the reciprocal satisfaction of human needs cannot proceed without positing individual labors as quantitatively determined parts of that total labor. Sorry, let me repeat that. Quote, labors are qualitatively equated as constituent elements of total social labor because the reciprocal satisfaction of human needs cannot proceed without positing individual labors as quantitatively determined parts of that total labor. In this duration, measured in terms of time, of their expenditure, the individual distinct useful labors count merely as modes of existence of the abstract human labor common to them all, end quote. However, this is said to reveal nothing as yet regarding the specifically social form of labor. In non-capitalist modes of production, owing to the fact that the social nexus is given prior to the activities of the individual actors. There exists an identity between the natural form and the social form of labor. The quantity and quality of total social labor are allocated, either consciously in communism or, quote, essentially unconsciously, end quote, according to normative criteria. Individual labors are thus determined a priori as social labors. In contrast to Rubin, therefore, Wolff's perspective allows us to conclude that the Soviet author restricts the validity of the social equation of labors to those social formations in which no social closure of access to specific spheres of activity exists. Yet, relative to the criterion of the proportional distribution of total social labor, this constitutes a new and narrower criterion, one that leaves room to speak of socially equated labor only in the specific context of capitalism. Only within the social intercourse of producers, only when the social interconnection of producers is indirectly mediated through the social mediation of labor products, namely exchange, does abstract labor, according to Wolff, become the specifically social form of concrete labors, thereby acquiring a real independence vis-a-vis these concrete labors within the medium of value. Marx explicitly draws attention to the distinct roles played by abstract labor in pre-capitalist versus capitalist societies, with the statement that, quote, in every social form of labor, the labors of different individuals are indeed related to one another as human labors. Yet here, this very relationship counts as the specifically social form of the labors, end quote. Wolff therefore speaks of, quote, abstract general labor, end quote, or alternatively, quote, abstract human labor, end quote, and in this specific form, quote, socially general labor, end quote. The third element, the equality of labors, is thus not generated within the act of exchange, as Heinrich's approach would seem to presuppose. Rather, conversely, it is already given by virtue of labor's transhistorical nature, serving merely to fulfill a new function, that of socially relating concrete private labors. Value theoretical substantialism, which, in positing a, quote, value substance, purports to identify a natural basis of natural process, is by contrast guilty of an irrational conflation. It conflates the specifically social function of abstract labor, a function it possesses, quote, solely within the exchange of labor products, end quote, with its transhistorical characterization as a general attribute inherent in all concrete labors. The commodities are, in fact, quote, values not simply because they are labor products per se, but because, as labor products per se, they are related to one another in a historically specific manner, end quote. According to Wolff, abstract labor, conceived as the social form of concrete activities, and thus as value substance, is, quote, posited, constituted, quote, solely and exclusively in and through the process of exchange, end quote. Wolff. Prior to this stage, abstract labor can exist only as a, quote, general attribute, end quote. An attribute which, however, precisely fails to constitute the historically specific social form of individual, concretely useful labors. Both Heinrich's and Haug's approaches are ultimately accused of transforming abstract labor into a specific variety of labor, while Haug is alleged to impermissibly conflate the function of the social form of private labors with the general characteristic of abstract labor, thereby misconstruing abstract labor as a natural basis. Heinrich is said to reduce this general characteristic to a form of equality produced exclusively by the context of the private division of labor. In doing so, albeit in a different manner than Haug, Heinrich fails to distinguish the bearers of social significance from that significance itself. In my view, however, it remains an open question whether such an, quote, Aristotelian position can legitimately be ascribed to Heinrich, even if some of his formulations appear to suggest as much. According to Wolff, the concept of, quote, real abstraction therefore does not imply that the abstraction of human labor, in an absolute sense, does not truly exist, or exists only in the mind of the theorist, until its reduction to abstract human labor is effected through the act of exchange. Rather, it implies merely that, in order to establish the social nexus of privately isolated labors within the context of exchange, this abstraction, which exists as a real characteristic of all concrete labors independently of exchange, and is not merely a flatus vocis, acquires significance in a specific manner, or becomes the bearer of a specific significance. This significance is one it did not already possess independently of exchange, and one that is not consciously or conventionally ascribed to it by the exchanging parties, but is instead constituted by the social nexus of the, quote, social relation of things, unquote, and the, quote, objective relation of persons, unquote. Thus, quote, real abstraction does not signify that the abstraction becomes, quote, real only within the act of exchange, but rather that, within and through exchange, and without the conscious agency of the exchanging parties, it acquires a specific significance, that of serving as the social form of private labors. In this respect, the concept of, quote, objective semantics, unquote, which Wolff employs to describe this phenomenon, suggests itself as a suitable substitute for the concept of real abstraction. In critical engagement with Helmut Reichelt, who here may stand as a representative for a whole range of theorists already mentioned, Wolff ultimately proposes a more precise formulation of Marx's demarcation from classical political economy. Reichelt, who's attempted a cognitivist validity theory of value, proceeding from the abstraction of exchange, is discussed in the following chapter, argues that, quote, the abstraction of exchange alone, end quote, does, quote, not suffice, end quote, to resolve the problematic of an objective additive value. Consequently, he suggests that, alongside the conceptual abstraction of exchange performed by subjects, one must simultaneously have recourse to the generation of value within the immediate production process. In this context, Marx is said to conceive of the value of the, quote, commodity at the initial stage without regard for exchange, since the latter has, quote, not yet taken place, unquote, at this point. In the subsequent passage from Marx regarding political economy, Reichelt therefore discerns a, quote, identical significance, end quote, between the concept of labor in classical theory and in Marx's critique of political economy, both of which he claims presuppose a, quote, pre-given, value-creating labor that is analogous to the abstract quality of value. The passage from Marx's Capital reads as follows, quote, political economy has indeed analyzed value and magnitude of value, albeit imperfectly, and has discovered the content hidden within these forms. Yet it has never even posed the question as to why this content assumes that specific form, why, in other words, that labor is represented in value, that the measure of labor, its duration, is represented in the magnitude of value of the product of labor, unquote. Marx. At this juncture, so Wolff argues critically against Reichelt, it must be established that the labor to which Marx refers here as the, quote, content that assumes the, quote, form of value itself constitutes a historically specific form. A historically specific social form. It is, quote, abstract human labor, which, as the socially general form of individual concretely useful labors, constitutes the content that assumes the forms of value, end quote. It is therefore by no means to be equated with the category of, quote, labor found in political economy, something, however, that, quote, Marx's formulation misleadingly suggests, end quote. Ricardo and others then did indeed trace the content of the mutually autonomous forms of wealth back to the unified, quote, substance of labor. Yet according to Wolff, this substance still constitutes a, quote, hodgepodge of concrete, useful, and abstract general labor. Following Wolff, Marx's critique could also be formulated in two distinct ways, depending on how the concept of, quote, content is understood. The first and more fundamental proposition would read, quote, it never even raised the question of why this content assumes that specific form. That is why concrete labor assumes the form of abstract value-forming labor, end quote. The second proposition would have to read, quote, it never even raised the question of why this content assumes that specific form. That is, why abstract labor manifests itself in the value of form, end quote. Why did I say that? Let me repeat that. I fucked that up. Following Wolff, Marx's critique could also be formulated in two distinct ways, depending on how the concept of, quote, content is understood. The first and more fundamental proposition would read, quote, it never even raised the question of why this content assumes that specific form. That is why concrete labor assumes the form of abstract value-forming labor, end quote. The second proposition would have to read, quote, it never even raised the question of why this content assumes that specific form. That is why abstract labor manifests itself in the form of value, end quote. The first proposition addresses the form giving of a transhistorical content, which can consist only of concrete useful labor, while the second addresses the objective manifestation of abstract human labor, which in this form is socially general labor, within value as its, quote, product. According to Wolff, therefore, Reichelt's equation of Ricardo and Marx lacks any plausibility in this context. Moreover, it imputes to Marx a, quote, substantialist position that he did not in fact espouse in Capital. In doing so, Reichelt not only relies on Marx's potentially misleading formulation regarding, quote, content and form, but also impermissibly isolates the, quote, individual commodity, as introduced at the beginning of the exposition in Marx's Capital. He does this by claiming that, according to Marx, this commodity must possess value in isolation from any reference to other commodities, as a solitary object, and that this value can therefore be derived solely from the immediate labor process. However, according to Wolff, a, quote, individual commodity is a contradictio in ejecto. Reichelt thus reifies what was, for Marx the theorist, merely a methodologically intended abstraction. This concept, he argues, captures the properties of use value and value as attributes of the individual commodity qua commodity. Quote, while abstracting from the relationship to the other commodity, yet simultaneously incorporating or proceeding with the knowledge of what it constitutes beyond its use value by virtue of its social relationship to that other commodity, namely value, end quote. Wolff. Sorry, 1 second. Fuck, where the hell am I? Okay. Blah, blah, blah. According to Wolff, Reichhelt's theoretical framework, a structure also found among a multitude of other interpreters of Marx's Capital, contains a fundamental conflation of the quantitative and qualitative dimensions of value. Here too, Wolff articulates an original conception that seeks to distinguish itself simultaneously from substantialist positions and from Heinrich's variant of a non-naturalistic theory of value. In Wolff's view, Reichelt is correct in asserting that the dimensions of value cannot be fully grasped through the abstraction of exchange, specifically insofar as the quantitative aspect of value cannot be determined solely within the sphere of commodity circulation. However, Wolff argues that Reichelt fails to clearly distinguish between quantity, which must be explained in terms of the production process, and quality, which must be explained in terms of the circulation process. Consequently, Reichelt constantly oscillates between deriving the quantity and quality of value either purely from acts of exchange, which he moreover reduces to mere mental movements of the subjects involved, or purely from the quote, antecedent production process of the commodities. The social attribute, quality of value, and its substance, abstract labor as the social form of private labors, is, in Wolff's view, initially non-quantifiable, because it represents non-sensuous attributes in social relations. Here the idea, also advanced by Heinrich, is taken to its logical conclusion, that abstract labor cannot be expressed, either in its significance as a general attribute of all concrete labors, or in its role as a social form of private labors. This implies, moreover, that it cannot exist in time either. Furthermore, since the quality of value consists in a specifically social relation, situated within the sphere of exchange, between products of labor, viewed merely as products of human labor in general, a relation that functions as the social form of use values, this quality can in no way be derived from the production process as such. Any attempt to do so, Wolff argues, would culminate in a value theoretical substantialism and constitute a, quote, underestimation of commodity circulation, end quote. Thus, with a radicalism similar to Heinrich's, Wolff rejects the standard accusations of, quote, circulationism, and in doing so critiques a, quote, productivism inherent in Marxist interpretations of value substance and value objectivity. Quote, to speak of a magnitude of value, unquote, runs the provisional conclusion, quote, therefore appears to be a contradictio in ejecto, unquote. It is possible to conceptually grasp the magnitude of value only, quote, by way of concrete useful labor, unquote, the sole form of labor that possesses a temporal and therefore quantifiable dimension. The magnitude of value is determined by, quote, socially general labor time, end quote, conceived as an average measure of simple labor, which is itself shaped by the broader societal interconnection between the development of the productive forces, which define the prevailing average conditions of production, and effective demand. These overarching societal interconnections, which determine the magnitude of value, are in turn, quote, determined by forms of value, and thus by objective expressions of abstract human labor, end quote, forms that Marx introduces in the first chapter of Capital by way of anticipation. In this context, the distinction between individually expended labor time and socially general labor time must be taken into account. Since socially general labor time constitutes a social relation of validity, one that can be measured solely in the form of money and not prior to exchange, when it remains unclear precisely how much concrete labor time was expended under average conditions of production, and thus how much of it counts as average labor time. And since it is realized only through money, the socially coercive form of average labor duration cannot be measured with a clock, nor can it be reduced to a unit of energetic physical exertion. In this instance, Wolff, much like Heinrich, also speaks of, quote, abstract labor time. End quote. Quality and quantity are thus evidently linked by the following circumstances. 1. Value quality constitutes a society-wide dynamic that influences, in a manner merely anticipated in the first chapter, the conditions of production determining the magnitude of value. Specifically, simple average labor as an epoch and society-specific magnitude. 2. Quantity possesses a social character, quote, corresponding to that of quality. Both are society-wide relations of validity. Quote, just as concrete useful labor counts, in a form distinct from itself, as abstract human labor, and thus as socially general labor, so too does the labor time expended in concretely useful labor count, in a form distinct from itself, namely as abstract labor time, as socially general labor time. End quote. Both are represented in money. Quote, in money, the labor time expended, immediately and individually in the form of concretely useful labor, counts as general social labor time, distinct from that specific individual expenditure. End quote. And both are indifferent to any specific individual concretely useful labor. Quote, value behaves with indifference toward use value, in the sense that it must be some product that counts as the objectification of abstract human labor, and it does not matter what kind of concretely useful product it happens to be. Correspondingly, regarding the labor time actually expended in the form of concretely useful labor, what matters is that labor time is expended and how much is expended, not the particular concretely useful form in which it is expended. The fact that only time matters is a characteristic of social quality, a quality that begins with the formal indifference of value towards use value, and of abstract human labor toward concretely useful labor, which finds its ultimate realization in the indifference of capital toward the labor process. End quote. If the prevailing notion until now has been that value or its substance constitutes the qualitative foundation upon which commodities can be quantitatively compared, as Brentel suggests, this view now becomes problematic. What Wolff plausibly demonstrates is that the thesis regarding the identity of qualitative and quantitative dimensions of value leads to a conflation of concrete and abstract labor. Specifically, it equates simple average labor with abstract labor, fails to conceive of simple average labor as the social outcome of an already value-determined dynamic, and ultimately situates value production in close proximity to physiological expenditures that, presumably, could be accomplished by a specific type of labor, even in the absence of the social interaction characteristic of privately organized division of labor-based production units. However, the manner in which Heinrich and Wolff address the magnitude of value appears to lead to a dualism. Wolff suggests that the quantity of value possesses a character corresponding to its quality, yet argues that this quantity must be explained indirectly, via concrete labor, albeit labor that is itself form-determined. The question that then arises, however, is why continue to speak of the quantity of value at all? Wolff appears to justify this by arguing that a relation of social validity is invariably at play here, and that an indirect sociality, mediated through money, characterizes both the quality and the quantity of value. Yet is not at least the former merely an analogy? Nothing of a quantitative nature actually transpires within abstract labor itself. We remain entirely on the level of concrete labor, even if that labor is not necessarily individual in nature. Moreover, it must be noted that average working time, conditioned as it is by the quote, average production conditions quote, of a given industry of society, and indeed by the value-determined society-wide process of the development of productive forces, is by no means identical to any individual working time, yet provided it is not erroneously defined as a weighted average. It is indeed identical to the empirical, ! Working time of the quote, majority of producers, or so at least argues Rojas, or alternatively, to the labor of those producers representing the quote, middle productivity class, quote, as Rosdolsky suggests. Must this working time, then, even if it only reveals itself to be the average working time in retrospect, also be measured by the clock? Gerhard Stoppelfeld addresses a further central problem: the tendency to treat the question of the magnitude of value within the framework of concrete sensuous labor leads, Stoppelfeld argues, to theoretical aporia regarding value. For here a displacement of the problem of commensurability occurs, shifting from value itself toward use value, particularly when the quantum of value of a product of complex labor is determined by a multiple of simple labor, since a common denominator must then be found even at the level of concrete labors. Yet, quote, the equation of qualitatively distinct labors cannot, as Ricardo conceived it, be undertaken on the basis of one of these specific labors. It is not possible, on the one hand, to declare the labor of a farmhand to be the standard that renders various labors commensurable, while on the other hand simultaneously maintaining that this very labor is unequal, Stoppelfeld. Thus, important problems remain unresolved, precisely because authors such as Heinrich and Wolff have, with the utmost clarity, identified the substantialist category errors inherent in the identification of concrete labor with abstract labor. In the context of the problem of clarifying the nature of value substance, Wolff ultimately formulates a critique grounded in fundamental theory regarding Heinrich's rejection of the necessity of a commodity money. The question to be posed to Heinrich in this regard is whether his thesis concerning the, quote, deeper lying sign character of money, detached from the use value of an equivalent product of labor, can be substantiated on non-conventionalist grounds, something Marx explicitly denies. Wolff casts doubt on this, precisely the transition from the thesis that every form of money is a sign because it is a use value accepted as value per se, to the thesis that operates by analogy with the, quote, sign for, quote, animal, end quote, unquote, reveals a rupture, a point at which Wolff's critique implicitly takes hold. For the former, the constitution of the sign character, or as Wolff puts it, a, quote, objective semantics, end quote, must be understood as arising from a social relation of things without the conscious intervention of the actors involved. The latter, however, presuppose a pre-existing conventional agreement regarding the use of a symbol to designate a specific genus, given that the symbol itself does not originate from the designated genus. According to Wolff, in the quote, replacement of the equivalent commodity by signs of itself, the conventionalist agreement, entailing the conscious intervention of economic agents, always comes into play, end quote. Heinrich thus conflates the correct thesis 1, that the conventionalist thesis 2, Heinrich thus conflates the correct thesis 1 with the conventionalist thesis 2, for he is evidently able to, quote, imagine that, even at the level of abstraction, at which the simple form of value is examined in the first chapter, the second commodity could already be replaced by signs of itself, end quote. Yet this is impossible, since the first chapter presents a phenomenon that is, quote, naturally evolved, end quote, naturwachsig, and unconscious, a process that, as Heinrich himself notes elsewhere, unfolds independently of the cognitive states of the commodity owners. Ultimately, Heinrich engages in an unmediated correlation of token money with commodity value by asserting that, even at the level of exposition within the analysis of the form of value, the equivalent commodity can be replaced by a non-commodity, quote, something symbolizing, quote, value as such, unquote. He conflates the level of abstraction at which human beings consciously relate to already constituted forms of wealth, simple circulation as discussed in the third chapter of Marx's Capital, with the level at which something unfolds unconsciously within the social relation of the products of labor, the analysis of the form of labor. The term, quote, value as such, unquote, paves the way for this conflation, which notably contradicts Heinrich's own reflections regarding the significance of the individual stages of exposition, by detaching value from the very social relation of labor products that constitutes it. The subsequent step within the framework of analyzing the form of value is then to allow this, quote, value as such, unquote, now no longer dependent upon the social relation of things, to be represented not within that relation, but directly through a non-commodity token. Ultimately, through his example of involving animal tokens, Heinrich toys with the reified self-evidence of mere illustrations, thereby disregarding the aspect, which he himself rightly emphasized elsewhere, of the unconscious constitution of forms of wealth. Wolff therefore draws the conclusion that, although, quote, money emerges precisely in the context of its practical genesis, within the actions of commodity owners, the absolutely necessary and solely scientifically justifiable premise, end quote, must be seen in the fact, quote, that it must emerge from the relation of simple commodities, conceived as units of use value and value, in which the general equivalent, which is qualitatively identical to money, is not yet presupposed in a circular manner, end quote. Consequently, for logical systematic reasons, only a commodity, specifically one commodity among others, can serve as money. Any other approach would result in an impermissible historicization of the money commodity. During the 1970s in particular, Marx's concepts of value and value substance were examined by a number of analytic philosophers who ostensibly subjected their substantialist interpretations to criticism. Johann Nanninga, whose text may be regarded as paradigmatic of the analytic positions regarding Marx's theory of value during the 1970s, undertakes in his 1975 work, as a preliminary step, to critically scrutinize the inference Marx draws from exchange value to value in the opening pages of Marx's Capital. This critique, Nanninga claims, is on the one hand more radical than the well-known critique advanced by Eugen Böhm-Bawerk. Yet on the other hand, and in contrast to Böhm-Bawerk's approach, It represents an attempt to liberate Marx's theoretical framework, quote, from unnecessary ballast, end quote. Böhm-Bawerk's critique of Marx's inference to value, or more precisely to abstract labor as the, quote, common third element, focuses primarily on the surreptitious introduction of the goods undergoing exchange as products of labor, as well as on alleged conflation of distinct procedures of abstraction. Marx, Böhm-Bawerk argues, confuses, quote, abstraction from a circumstance in general with abstracting from the specific modalities under which that circumstance manifests itself, end quote. With regard to use value, Marx abstracts from its particular concrete forms, yet erroneously equates this act of abstraction with a complete disregard for, or abstraction from, use value per se. Conversely, when considering the attribute of being a product of labor, Marx suddenly abstracts solely from the specific forms of labor rather than from labor per se. Böhm-Bawerk therefore suggests that use value per se could very well serve as the sought-after, quote, common third. Nanninga, however, distinguishes his own position from Böhm-Bawerk's, both in terms of form and content. Substantively, Nanninga observes that, quote, use value functions merely as a, quote, general rubric encompassing all the various possible purposes, end quote, that diverse objects might serve. It therefore designates something singular and specific at each individual instance. The abstraction of utility in general signifies, quote, merely that one moves from the proposition A serves the purposes X, Y, end quote, to the proposition, quote, there exist purposes that A serves, end quote. For the proof of the latter proposition, nothing is available other than the specification of the purposes themselves. However, one precludes this very specification through the act of, quote, abstraction. Thus, one cannot speak of utility, conceived as use value, as being, quote, general or, quote, in general, end quote, end quote. Conversely, abstracting from all the concrete purposes the various objects may serve for human beings does not, in itself, provide any basis for comparing precisely these disparate purposes. Formally speaking, Böhm-Bawerk merely proposes an alternative substantive elaboration of the, quote, inference to a third term, end quote. Yet he does not critique Marx's, quote, method of omission, end quote. Yet it is precisely this critique that must be undertaken in order to unburden Marx's approach of its metaphysical ballast. For Nanninga claims to expose the step of abstraction, leading from exchange value to value, as a, quote, formally specious justification, end quote. In the book Capital, Marx initially proceeds from the premise of the transitivity of commodity exchange relations, formulating this premise as the requirement that exchange values, conceived as quantitative proportional relations of use values, must be, quote, exchange values that are mutually substitutable or of equal magnitude, end quote. However, Marx does not explicitly provide a justification for this transitivity, a justification that could, admittedly, be easily supplied. It is the assumption of systematic exchange relations that suggest the transitivity, and by extension the equivalence of, exchange relations, while a fortuitous chain of exchanges involving three commodities might indeed exhibit inconsistencies, in the sense that, through the clever exploitation of such a chain, a profit could be realized solely through the act of exchange itself, e.g. 1 unit of cloth exchanges for 2 skirts, 2 skirts exchange for 1 kilogram of wheat, and the wheat is ultimately exchanged back for 2 units of cloth. Such a scenario would, in the long run, lead to the elimination of this profit opportunity, provided that all 3 commodity owners sought to avail themselves of this opportunity. With this reflection, however, equivalent exchange may now be considered sufficiently defined. However, instead of being content with the formal, quote, solution to the problem of equality, Marx, according to Nanninga, impermissibly presses further, asking what positive attribute of commodities enables them to be placed within an equality relation. For Nanninga, this constitutes a superfluous operation, since the very assertion that every commodity is equal, because it possesses exchange value, already represents a reduction to the shared attribute of utility for exchange. In this context, Marx's view that exchange value is an abstraction from all use value is true in a trivial sense, as this follows directly from the conceptual distinction between exchange value and use value. Yet Marx, employing a, quote, naive method of omission, end quote, allegedly seeks a, quote, third term, a positive attribute of commodities that would serve as the very foundation for their comparability, in which he identifies as, quote, abstract labor. Formally, this procedure fails because the mere omission of attribute ascriptions cannot yield a residual, uniquely determinable attribute of the objects in question. The, quote, remaining possibilities for prediction, end quote, regarding these objects are, therefore, quote, determined only negatively, end quote. The very inquiry into this, quote, ominous third term, end quote, stems from a linguistic imprecision. The manner in which Marx introduces exchange equality as a form of concrete equality, specifically by simply writing, quote, X units of commodity A equals Y units of commodity B, end quote, instead of, quote, X units of commodity A are worth Y units of commodity B, end quote, or by initially introducing the term, quote, exchange value in the opening chapter on commodities as an asymmetrical concept, namely as varying quantities of different commodities that are exchangeable for a single given commodity. As Nanninga puts it, quote, instead of arriving at the question of the extent to which commodities are mutually exchangeable, can be termed, quote, equal in exchange value, end quote, one now arrives at the question of the extent to which the exchange values of a single commodity can be equal, end quote. In contrast, Nanninga defines the concepts of use value, exchange value, and exchange value equality as follows. Use value is the utility of a commodity, quote, within context of action outside of exchange, end quote, whereas exchange value is the, quote, utility of commodities for the purpose of exchange, quote. Exchange value equality is to be understood initially solely as an abstract equality, as it describes the equality or substitutability of statements regarding one quantity of a commodity with those regarding another. In this context, all statements concerning the commodities that do not pertain to their exchange ratio are disregarded. In contrast to this abstract equality, concrete equality, or identity of objects, exists only when they are indistinguishable. Quote, even though one has imposed no restrictions whatsoever on the means of distinction, end quote, that is, when all of their properties are identical. In everyday language, this distinction is reflected in the fact that one does not say, quote, 2 kilograms of flour are equal to 1 kilogram of sugar, end quote, but rather, quote, 2 kilograms of flour are worth 1 kilogram of sugar, end quote. As demonstrated, Nanninga identifies the sufficient condition for the equality of exchange value in the property of transitivity. That is to say, if X units of commodity A exchange for Y units of commodity B, Y units of commodity B for Z units of commodity C, then X units of commodity A must exchange for Z units of commodity C. This constitutes the, quote, formal prerequisite, end quote, of the equality of exchange value, or alternatively, quote, general utility for exchange, end quote. Commodities are thus deemed, quote, equal in exchange value, end quote, quote, if they are equally useful for the acquisition of any other commodity, end quote. Yet at the same time, this states nothing whatsoever regarding, quote, why specific quantities of commodities are equal in exchange value, end quote. Transitivity merely establishes specific relations between proportions. However, that which determines these proportions, specifically what places not just any arbitrary quantities of commodities, but rather very specific quantities, here is designated as X, Y, and Z, into a transitive relationship with one another, remains unexplained. This, quote, determination of the magnitude of a proportion in itself, end quote, is therefore distinguished by Ninga from exchange value and is termed, quote, value. In summary, 2 points can be established. Ninga's method of abstraction, which leads to the concept of equal exchange value, presupposes the creation of exclusive criteria regarding possible predications based upon the formal foundation of an equivalence relation. This criterion consists in the compatibility of statements with the conditions of the equality relation, that is, the substitutability of the objects with respect to their role within that relation. The category of the abstract equality of the relata involved in an exchange relationship can thus be understood merely as an altered, quote, mode of speaking about the properties of the exchange relation itself, one that yields no further, quote, substantive insights, end quote. Consequently, the question regarding the qualitative basis of exchange relations is effectively shelved as a mere case of, quote, linguistic bewitchment, end quote. What remains of this question is solely the quantitative dimension of determining the magnitude of the proportions to be exchanged, the quantum of their utility for exchange. Quote, let the quantity of socially necessary labor time embodied in a product be called its value, end quote. This is introduced as a quantitative residual category that has nothing further to do with any problem of commensurability. For, quote, exchange value is a concept independent of value, end quote. Thus, not only the quantitative but also the qualitative dimension of the question regarding the possibility of commensurability ultimately remains unanswered. Following Georg Lohmann, it can be observed that in the analytical critiques of the concept of the, quote, tertium comparitationis, following Georg Lohmann, it can be observed that in the analytical critiques of the concept of the tertium comparationis, critiques also found in the works of authors such as Ulrich Krause and Ulrich Steinfort, quote, the commensurability of commodities is presupposed, end quote. A significant illustration of this is provided by an example from Steinfort, one also contested by Lohmann, intended to demonstrate the superfluity of a, quote, content distinguishable, end quote, from the relata as a necessary condition for the possibility of a relation. Quote, the statement, for instance, end quote, writes Steinfort, quote, the A won as many points as B in a game of chance does not imply the existence of a property such as, quote, luck in gaming, end quote, distinct from the mere ratio in which A's points and B's points are placed, end quote. Steinfort. Even if the untenability of this line of reasoning, when posited as a counter-argument to Marx, is immediately apparent, it is worth noting here that Steinfort, by a priori comparing the points of two individuals, A and B, individuals who as human beings are as qualitatively distinct as 20 yards of linen in one coat, has already defined these individuals in terms of a, quote, third term, common to them both, namely the game points, thereby establishing a qualitative ground upon which they can subsequently be compared solely in quantitative terms. In Marx's framework, the role played here by the, quote, points is assumed by, quote, abstract labor. Steinfort's example thus serves to confirm precisely that which it purports to refute. Steinfort finds justification, or at least a demonstration of the plausibility of the labor theory of value, only in the 4th chapter of Capital. In the 3rd chapter, Marx accordingly develops the, quote, problem of money hoarding, and, quote, while monetarily mediated exchange immediately makes commodity exchange, quote, easier. It does not thereby make it any more secure, since buying and selling no longer necessarily coincide, and commodity owners must reckon with the possibility that their goods may prove unsaleable. Money, Steinfort argues, therefore, and in addition to serving as a means for the immediate acquisition of any form of social wealth, assumes the, quote, function of providing protection against the uncertainty of commodity exchange, end quote. Thus, alongside the circulation, medium function of money as a means to acquire other commodities, there emerges the function of money as a store of value, a function that constitutes it as a, quote, goal of acquisition in its own right, end quote. Quote, with the further development of commodity production, end quote, Marx observes, quote, every commodity producer must secure for himself the nervus rerum, the, quote, social pledge, end quote. His needs are ceaselessly renewed and demand the ceaseless purchase of others' commodities, whereas the production and sale of his own commodities take time and depend on chance, end quote. However, if money is hoarded and thereby withdrawn from circulation, it is placed in opposition to money's function as a medium of circulation. According to Steinfort, if such accumulation of treasure reaches a sufficient scale, this would, quote, withdraw enough money from the vital circulation of commodities to thereby cripple commodity exchange, end quote. The condition for the compatibility of these contradictory determinations is, Steinfort concludes, to be found in industrial capital, conceived as a sum of money that sustains and augments itself as it passes through the circulation and consumption of a specific commodity. In other words, by preserving and indeed augmenting exchange value, serving as a means of, quote, security or store of value, circulation is simultaneously kept, quote, liquid, serving as a medium of circulation. Mutual overreaching by merchant capitalists or shrewd trading of individual commodity producers is ruled out as a criterion for compatibility, for ultimately these constitute a zero-sum game that merely leads back to simple circulation and, consequently, to the inherent tension between the money's function as a store of value and its function as a medium of circulation. Quote, the problem, argues Steinfort, quote, can only be resolved if money is used to purchase a commodity whose consumption results in the creation of a new commodity, end quote. A process which ultimately presupposes the existence of the commodity labor power. It is within this analysis, specifically the demonstration of how exchange mediated production prevents mere money hoarding, undertaken as, quote, security against the uncertainties of exchange, and thus liable to cause the long-term paralysis of exchange itself, that the plausibility of Marx's labor theory of value is revealed, a theory which Steinfort contends is superior to all other theories regarding the preservation of value through its augmentation. In particular, Steinfort regards as contrived Böhm-Bawerk's objection to the labor theory of value, namely that a commodity owner could preserve or augment their value through the medium of circulation and without engaging in production simply by means of shrewd exchange or through the utilization of naturally regenerating resources, such as, quote, timber on the stump, end quote. The first objection, Steinfort notes, amounts merely to mutual overreaching and thus yields no actual profit, The second, meanwhile, involves, quote, too few goods, quote, to effectively and permanently overcome the practice of money hoarding, end quote. Thus, Marx's fundamental thesis, the value is created through labor, gains its true, quote, persuasive force, end quote, only at this juncture. Indeed, it is the theory of surplus value that ultimately serves to substantiate the labor theory of value. Therefore, while the derivation of the substance of value, abstract labor, in the first chapter may be untenable, the significance of this chapter emerges retrospectively from the perspective of the theory of capital, rendering it intelligible as an intense anticipatory summary. One second. Okay. Returning to Naninga, he appears to be entirely oblivious to Marx's qualitative inquiry, namely the endeavor to provide an explanation for empirically observable forms of wealth by means of a non-empirical theatrical plane. This becomes particularly evident in his exposition of the analysis of the form of value. While he too acknowledges the much invoked ascent from the abstract to the concrete as Marx's method in Capital, he nevertheless misses the specific significance of the levels of abstraction employed in the opening chapters. 2 points in particular suggest this. First, his puzzled inquiry as to why the development of categories within the analysis of the form of value must proceed in such an idealist or conceptual dialectical manner. Second, his erroneous characterization of the evolution from the Grundrisse to Capital of the manner in which the relationship between the immanent and external measure of value is presented. Naninga does initially correctly observe that certain elements which Marx, quote, elaborated in the Grundrisse in connection with money could, in fact, have been developed systematically quite independently of money, end quote. A point that draws particular attention to the subsequent introduction of the categories of the simple and the expanded forms of value. However, he proceeds to draw the conclusion that the distinction, still maintained in both the Grundrisse and a contribution to the critique of political economy, between on the one hand the analytical comparison of commodities, quote, in the head of the scientist, based on socially necessary labor time, and, on the other, the actual equation of commodities performed by economic agents during the real act of exchange, mediated by money, has effectively been abolished in Marx's Capital. As Naninga puts it, quote, if, however, in actual exchange, the comparison of commodities were to take place without the aid of money, solely on the basis of the qualitative nature of their exchange values qua values, then Marx would, as a logical consequence, have been compelled to abandon the very juxtaposition of, quote, comparison in the head, and, quote, versus, quote, comparison in actual exchange. This conclusion, as will be demonstrated below, is incorrect. Particularly in Capital, and above all in its first edition, Marx consistently distinguishes between those abstractions and interrelations of commodities that are posited only theoretically by scientific consciousness and their actual relationship, the one into which they are placed by the commodity owners, who are systematically introduced only in the second chapter, as well as the abstractions that truly exist within this relationship, even if they remain imperceptible to the commodity owners. Nowhere in the first 3 sections of the first chapter of Marx's Capital is an empirically real act of exchange described. Naninga, however, holds a different view. Naninga interprets the analysis of the form of value as a depiction of simple non-monetary exchange, whereas in the book, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, Marx allegedly suggests, quote, that simple exchange, end quote, of value-determined commodities without money, quote, was an impossibility, end quote. In Capital, he supposedly argues, quote, precisely the opposite, end quote. The fact that Marx here attempts to explain the phenomenon of immediate exchangeability in a non-circular manner, and thus without recourse to money as a premise, is misconstrued by Ninninga as a thesis regarding the empirical primacy of non-monetary exchange values over monetary mediated exchange. Consequently, the analysis of the form of value appears to him merely as a, quote, convoluted way of speaking about the equivalence relation. That is to say, for Ninninga, the problem of explaining immediate exchangeability does not exist at all, since it is already presupposed as a given. Thus, Ninninga reduces the polar relationship between the relative form of value and the equivalent form to a mere equivalence relation in which both commodities simultaneously constitute both the relative form of value and the equivalent form, and are therefore immediately exchangeable. The polar relationship, he claims, this polar relationship, Ninninga claims, can be observed only from the participant's perspective, that of the commodity owners, a perspective he regards as belonging quite naturally to the first chapter of Marx's Capital. In doing so, Ninninga is able to cite a specific passage found in the appendix to the first edition of Capital. It reads, quote, let us imagine an exchange between linen producer A and coat producer B. The linen producer says 20 ells of linen are worth one coat, and the coat producer says one coat is worth 20 ells of linen. Here both, the linen and the coat, exist simultaneously in the relative form of value and in the equivalent form, but nota bene, I don't know how to say that, Nota space BENE, I don't know what it means, I don't know how to say it, as two different persons, end quote. However, what is at issue here is actually an empirically popularized, quote, illustration of the development of the value form, one that may well have been intended for the, quote, dialectically uneducated reader, end quote, yet which, as Ninninga's example demonstrates, has only served to confuse such a reader all the more. Consequently, those passages in Capital, in which Marx consistently demonstrates that a pre-monetary exchange of commodities is impossible, are systematically ignored by Ninninga. Since in his analysis of the value form, Marx aims to explain how systematic exchange is possible, and how the forms of wealth empirically observable therein are to be accounted for without a priori conceptually presupposing them. He establishes right at the beginning of this analysis, and contrary to the aforementioned example, and its interpretation is evidence for a pre-monetary theory of exchange, that, quote, the same commodity cannot simultaneously appear in both forms, bracket, the relative value form and the equivalent form, in bracket, within the same expression of value, end quote. Otherwise, we would find ourselves back in the paradoxical Proudhonian situation, where systematic commodity exchange is supposedly possible, a situation in which all commodities are immediately exchangeable and constitute their own money. Yet this would fundamentally contradict the very conditions under which goods become commodities, conditions which Ninninga himself describes at length as an indirect form of the socialization of labor under conditions of private, socially divided production. The astonishing result of this, quote, analytical variant of a critique directed against the supposedly, quote, substantialist elements of Marxist theory of value is therefore a surreptitious substantialism that goes hand in hand with a pre-monetary theory of exchange. Although the thesis of a logically systematic structure underlying Marx's mode of presentation is accepted by most analytical authors, many of them are evidently unwilling to grasp the significance of the step of abstraction taken between the second and first chapters of Marx's Capital. Thus, Ninninga is able to make the discussions regarding the theoretical or, quote, thought relations of commodities within the analysis of the value form plausible to himself, only through the lens of exchange theory, which in this instance amounts to an empiricist perspective, interpreting them as a depiction of actual non-monetary commodity exchange. Going a step further than Ninninga is the work of Jürgen Schomple from 1982. Schomple accuses Ninninga of adopting the quote, pseudo-problem, unquote, of commodity theory, unquote, by seeking the significance of the value equation merely, quote, informal logical conditions of equivalence, unquote, rather than, as a prerequisite, posing the question regarding the legitimacy of Marx's constitution of the object, formulated from a constructivist and linguistic pragmatic perspective. In doing so, he adopts the question of the value equation as, according to Schomple, it was incorrectly posed by Marx, a question which, incidentally, does not postulate a relationship of total equality, as Ninninga presumes, but rather specifically seeks a, quote, specific relationship of equality, end quote, between objects with respect to a particular aspect. Marx's question, Schomple argues, refers to the value equation, quote, X commodity A equals Y commodity B, end quote, and reads, quote, what does this equation state, end quote, rather than reading, quote, what do the exchanging subjects express within it, end quote. It is precisely this methodological abstraction from the commodity owners and their actual acts of exchange that give rise to the question of a, quote, common third element, end quote, residing within commodities qua things. Schomple's fundamental thesis is, therefore, that Marx falls victim to a methodologically induced, quote, bewitchment by language, end quote, by failing to conceive of the analysis of commodities as an analysis of exchange from the very outset, that is, by beginning conceptually with the commodity itself, or the relationship between commodities, rather than the relationship between the exchanging subjects. He substantializes and reifies those properties that accrue to goods solely through the act of exchange, and ultimately views exchange as a, quote, unmediated relationship between things, end quote. In the first instance, concerning the, quote, commodity, Marx substitutes two place predicates, or, quote, relational concepts, with, quote, one place designations of objects or properties, end quote. And in the second instance, he abstracts from the social system of reference for these relations, a system which, in the second chapter of Marx's Capital, is subsequently introduced in an unmediated fashion. This objectivism, this disregard for the constitutive attribution of properties within exchange, therefore leads, as a logical consequence, to a mysticism that, quote, anthropomorphizes, quote, commodity things, end quote, unquote, hypostatizing them into agents of action that exchange themselves. The abstraction from exchange, which after all is precisely what generates the significance of objects as commodities, is thus in principle illegitimate. It is precisely this abstraction, Schomple argues, that places Marx in the, quote, peculiar position of having to say something about things that count as commodities only within the context of exchange, without, however, being permitted to make exchange itself the explicit object of his investigation, end quote. Thus, the functions that objects acquire in the acts of exchange, where goods serve as a medium of exchange, or consumption, where goods serve as a means of use, quote, inevitably coalesce into a concept of a, quote, thing, endowed with invisible properties, a thing of spectral objectivity, end quote. Yet from Schomple's perspective, even the phrasing, quote, properties accruing through exchange, end quote, must be rejected as hypostatizing. Consequently, the correct formulation should instead read, quote, constitutive acts of the exchangers, end quote. Here, the value equation is dissolved into a symbolically mediated interaction between private property owners. Accordingly, The reifying discourse regarding, quote, value is understood to refer to the act of, quote, valuing. The concept of, quote, value expression points to the act of, quote, linguistically expressing value, end quote. And the notion of a, quote, measure of value, end quote, refers to the act of, quote, measuring value, end quote. Whereas in Marx's account, quote, commodities articulate their value within the reified framework of the value equation by means of their use value, end quote, thereby causing the commodities themselves to, quote, mutate into signs of their own being, into the very subjects of the sign process, end quote. In the context of, quote, actual exchange, it is the individuals who articulate the exchange value of their products, the signified, within the framework of the value equation, the signifier, end quote. The value equation and value expression are conceived as speech acts, in which subjective purpose determinations, understood as relations between individuals and things, generate the character of labor products as means of exchange, that is, commodities as objects whose purpose is to be exchanged, while intersubjective acts of negotiation, performed with conscious reference to socially average labor time, constitute the exchange value of these commodities, understood as the quantitative dimension of these means of exchange, or the, quote, magnitude of their utility for exchange, end quote. The equivalence relation, the sign of equality posited between commodities, thus signifies nothing other than, quote, the mutual recognition and quality of will, end quote, among the exchanging subjects. It serves merely as a linguistic expression for the, quote, intersubjective relationship between the exchangers, end quote. Ultimately, therefore, it is legal relations, specifically relations of autonomous private will, that bring forth the various forms of wealth. Acts of exchange, along with all the determinations discoverable within them, are semantically equivalent to acts of contract. If, conversely, Marx is seen as analyzing these forms of wealth in isolation from this very specifically defined, quote, context of action, end quote, the context, quote, in which value expressions are employed as linguistic signs, end quote. And if, in his analysis of the commodity, he is seen as appealing not to the rules of, quote, language games, but rather to objective reified properties, then he must be regarded as an exponent of a mechanical materialism, a position against which the practical materialism of Ludwig Wittgenstein might be counterposed. Moreover, this analysis of the commodity is said to contradict even Marx's own historical materialist program. It fails to do justice either to his nominalist critique of the Hegelian, quote, inversion of subject and predicate, end quote, a critique that takes issue with Hegel's mystification of the properties of human action by reifying them into autonomous acting subjects, or to the epistemological shift articulated in his thesis on Feuerbach, his decisive break with a, quote, contemplative materialism, end quote, that views reality solely in the guise of the object, rather than from a subjective practical standpoint. The discourse concerning the existence of abstractions, particularly within the Hegel-oriented reception of Marx, has come to be understood as a second demystification of patterns of argumentation in the philosophy of history, one appropriate to the very essence of capitalism. However, the discourse regarding, quote, real abstractions, which such approaches tend to favor, must by no means be conflated with the actual mystical personification of economic categories that Shampel erroneously imputes to them. This also applies to the terminology of the, quote, commodity as subject, end quote. Even when viewed from the conceptual framework of Hegel-oriented authors, such as Brentel or Kittsteiner, this terminology must be deemed misleading in several respects. First, because commodities are simply not acting subjects. Furthermore, it is misleading because what the concept of the subject is intended to convey in this context applies only with reference to the capital relation. It is solely within this relation, therefore, that the contents and forms of wealth, the, quote, substance, which are produced by human beings yet remain beyond their control, are continuously reproduced through a historically specific and objectively mediated production relation. This constitutes the deciphering of the rational core of Hegel's notion of, quote, substance as subject, quote, a notion which, moreover, possesses an additional ideology-critical dimension, insofar as it serves to expose the illusion that a supposedly immanent thing, G, is here spontaneously, without any mediation, reproducing itself in a greater volume, G prime. Shit, okay, no, fuck, I need to reread that, because, I think it says G, because it's like, it's actually very interesting how good Google Translate is at, like, recognizing what things, like for instance, like in other places where it's talking about capital, right? And it has like the formula, money, commodity, money, prime, which in German is what, GWG. That's like, what's it, Geld, Ware, or Geld. It typically translates the symbolism too, which I guess is some AI magic. But here, it's not doing that. So let me repeat that. This constitutes the deciphering of the rational core of Hegel's notion of, quote, substance as subject, end quote, a notion which, moreover, possesses an additional ideology-critical dimension, insofar as it serves to expose the illusion that a supposedly inanimate thing, money, is here spontaneously, without any mediation, reproducing itself in a greater volume, money prime. According to Marx, the, quote, automatic subject is a, quote, automatic fetish, end quote. In contrast, Schampel's categorical apparatus is incapable of grasping such processes of the autonomization of social interconnections, while he too concedes that, quote, people acted before they thought, and, quote, he lacks a concept of structure capable of articulating this. His, quote, theory of economic forms of life, end quote, which remains a mere postulate and is intended to elaborate the, quote, rules followed by actors in exchange, draws upon the concept of rules within the Wittgensteinian framework. In that framework, however, rules function merely as norms that enable action, and as linguistic symbol systems that generate meaning. Like Adorno, the approach of language game theory proceeds from the premise of the conceptual structuredness of the object of the social sciences, that is, from generalities that are effective in reality, yet are conceived as ideal, intersubjectively valid complexes of rules, thereby constituting collective, quote, ideal entities, end quote. Consequently, this approach may be characterized as a form of non-introspective and non-individualistic symbolic reductionism, one that systematically misses the original Marxian object, namely, quote, objective relations of persons and social relations of things, end quote, and instead adopts the, quote, standpoint of the economist, who knows only tangible things or ideas. Relations do not exist for him, end quote. Schampel's interpretation of the second chapter of Marx's Capital also aligns with this line of reasoning. Here he perceives a paradigm at work that stands in contradiction to the first chapter, arguing that Marx, quote, in the analysis of commodities, speaks of things and their properties, whereas in the analysis of exchange he speaks of human beings and their actions, end quote. Schampel. The praxeological pattern of argumentation, which now clearly approaches a historicist understanding, is underscored by the author's specific highlighting of Marxian terms within this chapter. Since Schampel refrains from a detailed analysis of these terms, opting instead to suggest rather than explain that the chapter constitutes a reduction and refutation of the categories of the first chapter based on action theory. These highlighted terms are cited here solely for illustrative purposes, quote, produced intentionally for the purpose of exchange, and quote, utility for exchange, and quote, custom fixes them as magnitudes of value, and quote, means of exchange for their owner, and quote, need, quote, natural instinct of the commodity owners, and so forth. Conversely, any appearance of categories or relational linkages derived from the structural theory is characterized as a, quote, objectivist contamination, of the argumentative flow of the second chapter. Thus, the forms of wealth, rightly identified as relational properties, are reduced to two very specific types of relations: human thing / human, given that Champo recognizes only tangible physiological properties of things, predications that have been mystified into supposed properties of things, or finally, subjective / intersubjective attributions of properties. His conception of the object ignores the fact that, under capitalism, the social relationship among producers is mediated exclusively through the relationship among their products of labor, that no immediate connection exists between producers and their products, or as Heinz-Dieter Kitzsteiner puts it, that, quote, behind the relationship of 20 yards of linen to one coat, there does not stand yet another, quote, human relationship. Rather, there, the producer's social relationship is this very relationship of things and no other, end quote. Even though the actors involved in exchange perform speech acts, these acts by no means constitute economic objects. Yet it is precisely in accordance with such a model, one appropriate at most to relationships of direct and planned socialization, that Champo conceives of economic objectivity. In doing so, however, he negates at the very outset the fundamental problem of how social cohesion is established amidst processes of production characterized by a private division of labor, that is, processes that are unplanned and not coordinated a priori. Champo is unable to accept the thesis that, within the relationship among products of labor, a relationship into which these products are placed by human beings, acting as private producers, these things acquire a meaning or validity that cannot be deciphered through a semantics grounded in human language, but only through an objective theory of meaning adequate to the, quote, language of commodities, end quote, as Marx metaphorically, exclamation point, end parenthesis, terms it. Second, the first chapter of Marx's Capital addresses the unintended structural effects of an unconscious and objectively mediated socialization. Specifically, semantic contents cannot be fully accounted for by the intentional acts of the actors or by their linguistic frame of reference. Marx is compelled to have recourse to a process of constitution that unfolds within a relationship of things and finds its expression in things. Thus he observes, quote, but commodities are things, whatever they are, they must be objectively or demonstrate themselves to be within their own objective relations, end quote. This does not imply that Marx reifies social relational properties into, quote, one-place properties of things, nor does it suggest he would claim that social relations emerge independently of the conscious, rule-governed actions of agents, or that they could be formulated in terms of a physicalist observational language. As Dieter Wolff puts it, in the consciousness-mediated contact between human beings, quote, the conditions for the emergence of the socially general, conditions of which they remain unaware, assert themselves, end quote. Ultimately, Champo can conceive of an unmediated relationship within exchange only in the sense that a direct relationship between people occurs without the mediating function of things, or in the mystical sense that things themselves enter into a direct relationship with one another without the, quote, intervention of human actions. Consequently, he is compelled to view the fetish character of commodities as a mere fabrication and is obliged to assert the, quote, fetish character of commodity theory, end quote, itself. Here are the blind spots in Wittgenstein's thought, so aptly articulated by Wolfgang Fritz Haug, exact their toll, quote, Whereas Wittgenstein directs his reflection toward the epistemic pitfalls of language, Marx directs his reflection toward the epistemic pitfalls inherent in the thing itself, as reflected in its specific mode of expression, that is, in the linguistic usage conditioned by that very thing, end quote. It also remains unclear how, quote, deceptive linguistic characteristics could be rationally grasped in any other way than, quote, on the basis of an analysis of deceptive characteristics of things, end quote. Approaches towards such a materialist grounding of Wittgenstein, undertaken with the perspective sensitized to the specific object-related problems of Marxian theory, can also be found in the work of Jürgen Ritzert. Ritzert is primarily concerned with the question of the extent to which there exist emergent properties that cannot be reduced to ideas or linguistic symbol systems. He further points out that the relationship between the concepts of, quote, language, quote, language game, and, quote, form of life remain unresolved in Wittgenstein's work. However, neither in Haug nor in Ritzert are more detailed statements to be found regarding the conception of economic objectivity. Consequently, neither position is given further consideration here. Even though, in the preceding discussion, I assessed the attempt to formulate a linguistic and action-theoretic conception of economic objectivity very critically, it must nonetheless be regarded as regrettable that such conceptions have remained mere postulates within the framework of Marxist discourse, and that their underlying intuitions were never fully elaborated into a competing, thus more concretely criticable theory. This applies both to critiques of substantialism and naturalism oriented toward Wittgenstein, specifically Tractatus II, and to those grounded on entirely different foundations, such as the work of Cornelius Castoriadis. An approach firmly situated within the tradition of action theory, albeit one operating primarily with Hegelian terminology, will be examined in greater detail in the following chapter through the lens of Helmut Reichhelt's theory of validity. In his retrospective on the reception of Marx within the analytic tradition, Martin Buller primarily refines and revises several of Nanninga's arguments. It is not the logical rigor of the Marxian inference, positing a, quote, third term, that enables exchange. This is open to doubt, but rather the substantive plausibility of its premises. Buller identifies two such premises. One, commodity exchange constitutes a form of equating commodities. Two, this relation of equality is of the type known as, quote, an external relation, end quote, a relation according to which equality obtains between two objects only if they share at least one property that inheres in them independently of their relationship to one another. Buller notes that this premise is rejected by analytic criticism. He proceeds to cite three passages drawn from the first chapter of Marx's Capital and from Marx's critique of Bailey in Theories of Surplus Value, intended to demonstrate that by positing value or abstract labor as the common, quote, third term, enabling the very comparability of commodities, Marx made a fundamental ontological presupposition regarding objects, one that places the properties of objects on a, quote, ontologically co-original, quote, footing with the objects themselves, while conceiving of the relations between objects as merely secondary phenomena. Quote, this conception of relation implies an ontological primacy of individual things and their properties over the relationships and context in which they are embedded, context in which their properties merely, quote, manifest themselves, end quote. This in turn, as Buller argues, following Ernst Michael Lange, corresponds to a classical conception of logic in which property expressions, i.e. predicates, enjoy a logical, quote, priority over relational expressions, end quote. Quote, value, Lange observes, quote, qua property, must necessarily underlie the relation of exchange value, for within a subject-predicate logic, relations are not regarded as primitive, bracket, here likely meaning, quote, fundamental, or, quote, original, end bracket, end quote. Two of the examples from Marx cited by Buhler are indeed to be understood as substantialist in the sense mentioned above. The measurement of weight, which according to Buhler is actually an external relation, one that is external to its relata, and the force of a thing. Finally, Marx is said to have expressed his general view regarding possible types of relations by asserting that, quote, properties of a thing do not spring from a thing's relation to other things, but rather merely manifest themselves in such a relation, end quote. According to this reading, it must be considered established that Marx thereby conceived of value in a substantialist manner, as a property, quote, that appertains to commodities independently of the act of exchange itself. It is an absolute magnitude, not a relative magnitude springing from exchange, end quote. Yet, contrary to Buhler's view, the validity of this latter statement as an accurate reflection of Marx's general understanding of relations must be decisively rejected. For one must consider the context in which this statement appears, a context that specifically critiques it as a fetishistic conception. The passage forms part of the exposition of the first peculiarity of the equivalent form, where the value of commodity A is expressed in the use value of commodity B and reads in its full context as follows, quote, but since properties of a thing do not spring from the thing's relation to other things, but rather merely manifest themselves in such a relation, it also appears as if the coat possesses its equivalent form, its property of immediate exchangeability, just as much by nature as it possesses its property of being heavy or of keeping one warm, end quote. In speaking of the, quote, properties of a thing, end quote, Marx is in fact referring solely to material properties, and he explicitly distinguishes these from the social, relational properties that a thing assumes as a commodity within the value relation. According to Marx, the failure to perceive this distinction between material essential properties and social relational properties is precisely what characterizes, quote, the bourgeois crude gaze of the political economist, end quote. According to Marx, the properties of commodities, specifically their status as a relative form of value and an equivalent form, accrue to them solely within the context of this mutual relation. They are, therefore, determinations of reflection. However, if one follows Marx's statement in the additions and alterations, the same now applies to the value quality of commodities themselves, which he explicitly defines as a shared property. Quote, outside of their relation to one another, the relation in which they count as equal, neither the coat nor the linen possess value objectivity, nor do they possess their objectivity as mere jellies of human labor, simpliciter. They possess this social objectivity only as a social relation, in a social relation, and only through this relation are mere products of labor, useful objects of use, transformed into commodities. A product of labor, considered in isolation, is therefore not value any more than it is a commodity. It becomes value only in its unity with another product of labor, or in the relation wherein the various products of labor are equated with one another as crystals of the same unity, human labor, end quote. Thus, in agreement with Kirchhoff and Voigtlinger, it must be maintained that for Marx, quote, the properties of economic objects themselves can be correctly theorized only as relational predicates, end quote. In contrast, Buhler evidently interprets the methodological abstraction of the, quote, commodity at the outset, or of the, quote, two commodities at the outset, is a realistic description. He fails to recognize that Marx here, by examining the individual commodity, or the relation between two commodities, is analyzing precisely what these commodities represent only within and through the systematic total societal exchange, namely commodities of equal value. Marx also appears to have anticipated the realistic or isolating misunderstanding in the additions. Quote, if I say that this product of labor is value because human labor has been expended in it, this is merely a subsumption of the product of labor under the concept of value. It is an abstract expression that encompasses more than explicitly states. The relation to other products of labor is therefore presupposed. End quote. Marx. According to Buhler, however, there now exist measurement processes that represent internal relations, temperature measurements, for example. That is, processes in which, quote, the property with respect to which the relation obtains is influenced by the relation itself, end quote. Marx's line of reasoning therefore constitutes, quote, an inference drawn from an insufficient set of premises, end quote. Ninninga's definition of the exchange value equality of commodities, by contrast, operates within the domain of modern logic, following Frege and Lorentzen, and transcends the, quote, object-oriented position, which does not admit the co-primordiality of one place, parenthesis, properties, end parenthesis, and multiplace, parenthesis, relations, end parenthesis, predicates. Consequently, the conditions for an equivalence relation, symmetry, reflexivity, transitivity, can be replaced by those of comparability. Quote, if two things are equal to a third, then they are also equal to one another, end quote. Hence the tertium comparationis sought by Marx can only be a third commodity, money, a point he himself confirms. Drawing upon Ulrich Krause's reflection on the logic of the value form, Buhler now argues that this implies, quote, contrary to Marx, end quote, that one can never assert of an exchange between two commodities considered in isolation, that it constitutes an exchange of equivalence. For as Krause notes, the equivalence relation, quote, does not refer to a single act of exchange, but rather to the entire structure of exchange. A single act of exchange can be described as an equivalent exchange only insofar as it constitutes an act within a structure of equivalent exchange, end quote. Thus, Buhler continues, Marx falls victim to a pseudo-problem when he places the isolated pre-monetary act of exchange between iron and wheat at the very beginning of his exposition and attempts to identify the conditions that make their equation possible. This leads him to posit the entity of, quote, value, an entity that is both unnecessary and moreover laden with essentialist connotations, is a common third term. Yet is value not here being sacrificed to Occam's razor too hastily, without due awareness of the problem of explaining money? Is Marx not here being credited with precisely what traditional Marxism is always imputed to Marx, namely that Marx explains the principle of equivalence by reference to a realistically conceived exchange of products? Is any distinction at all being drawn here between the theoretically conceived relation of commodities to one another and their actual relation? Finally, is it not being asserted in a quasi-Aristotelian fashion that it is money which renders commodities commensurable, thereby conflating the empirical presupposition of money with money's logical presupposition? However, Buhler evidently does not wish to sacrifice the concept of value as such but merely values interpretation as a, quote, abstract entity, an interpretation that, in Buller's view, entails an essentialist reading and the hypostatization of abstractions. According to the theory of equality and abstraction, which Ninninga introduces following Lorentzen, quote, value is a mode of discourse concerning concrete objects, rather than a really existing abstraction. One may therefore speak of the equality in value of two commodities, quote, if they fulfill exactly the same series of exchange values, exchanged for exactly the same quanta of other commodities, which means nothing other than that they satisfy exactly the same statements regarding the exchange nexus, end quote. Since, within the analytical paradigm, value denotes invariant statements regarding specific quantities of commodities, specifically concerning their significance within the exchange relation. Parentheses, see the transitivity of X units of commodity A, Y units of commodity B, and Z units of commodity C, in parentheses. Marx's distinction between absolute and relative value, parentheses, or more precisely between value itself and its relative expressions in terms of various quantities of other commodities, can, from this perspective, be meaningfully upheld. Okie dokie. So, that's the end of the section that I was reading, which I have to figure out what I was reading. So that was, I guess, section 3, or like heading 3 of section 1 of chapter 3 of part 1 of Ingo Elbe's Marx in the West. Chapter 3 of part 1 is titled Object Theoretical Consequences, and section 1 of that chapter is titled Critique of Pre-Monetary Value Theory, Abstract Labor, Value, and Money. And the heading that I have read in this video, which was obviously a very long heading, is titled Engaging with or Sidestepping Ambivalences, Intraparadigmatic Variance in the Debate Concerning Marx's Non/Substantialist Value Theory. Thank you so much for listening. The next section that I'm going to be reading is titled, let's see, let's do some forecasting here if I can do that. Let's see how long this section is. The next section that I'm going to be reading is titled Wertform and let's see. No, that's the German. Let's looking for the English translation. So the next section I'm going to be reading is titled Value Form Analysis and Money, on the debate regarding popularizations, discontinuities, and concealment in Marx's exposition, which has the headings, which I'm going to include in one video because it's only like 20 pages, this section. 1, the redundancy thesis of logico-historical orthodoxy, and 2, clarifying, there's 3. 2, clarifying the relationship between the first 2 chapters, popularization, discontinuity, historicization, ? And heading 3, new confusions. Thank you so much for listening.